L'appel, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur le greffier.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Hélier. Madame le connotateur de Saint-Laurent.
Présente.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Brelade.
Présent.
Monsieur le connotateur de la Trinité. Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Pierre.
Présent.
Madame le connotateur de Saint-Martin.
Présente.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Jean.
Présent.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Clément.
Présent.
Monsieur le connotateur de Gruville.
Présent.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Ouen. Monsieur le connotateur de Sainte-Marie.
Présent.
Monsieur le connotateur de Saint-Sauveur.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Southern.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Labby. Monsieur le deputy Tadier. Monsieur le deputy Luce. Madame le deputy Dublé. Monsieur le deputy Morel.
Présent.
Madame le deputy de Hegera. Monsieur le deputy Ayer. Monsieur le deputy Ward.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Owls. Madame le deputy Gardner. Monsieur le deputy Gorse.
Présent.
Monsieur le deputy Farnham.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Moore. Monsieur le deputy Mezek. Monsieur le deputy Balash. Monsieur le deputy Coles.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Porre. Monsieur le deputy War. Madame le deputy Miles.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Scott.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Renner.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Curtis.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Feltham. Madame le deputy Binet.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Jeune.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Miller.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Howell.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Binet. Monsieur le deputy Ferry.
Présent.
Madame le deputy Kovac. Monsieur le deputy Curtis. Madame le deputy Ward.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Wilson.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Stevenson.
Présente.
Monsieur le deputy Andrews.
Monsieur le doyen.
Notre aide soit au nom de Dieu qui a fait les cieux et la terre. Amen. Seigneur Dieu, Père éternel et tout-puissant, qui a établi les gouvernements et les puissances de la terre pour le règlement et pour la conduite du peuple, et qui nous a commandé d'avoir toujours pour but la gloire de ton saint nom. Nous te prions qu'il te plaise de donner à cette assemblée le don de conseil, de prudence, d'unir les cœurs et les affections de tous ceux qui la composent, de la conduire tellement toi-même par ton Saint-Esprit, que toute leur délibération étant combinée de ta bénédiction. Réussisse au bien tout seul chemin du peuple, qu'il t'a plu de commettre à leur soin. Car nous t'en prions au nom et par les mérites de ton Fils, bien-aimé Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur, qui nous a enseigné à t'invoquer en disant: Notre Père, qui es aux cieux, ton nom soit sanctifié, ton règne vienne, ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain quotidien, et nous pardonne nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous envoie pas en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal, car à toi est le règne, la puissance et la gloire, au siècle des siècles. Amen.
Madame le deputy Labby.
Ma'am, Deputy Lubby is out of the island on state's business in London. Thank you.
Members content to mark Deputy Labby as excuse. Absent on state's business.
Monsieur le deputy Tadier. Madame le deputy Dublé.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Owls.
Présente.
Madame le deputy Moore.
Defo.
Monsieur le deputy Mezek. Madame le deputy Porre.
Defo.
Monsieur le deputy War.
Mom, Deputy War is currently dealing with some parish business and he will be in this morning after that's been completed. If he could be marked excuse for this moment.
The priority should be the Assembly, but it's a matter for members. I think are members content to mark him as excuse.
Mum, may we know what the business is?
I'm sorry, Mum, I don't know. I wasn't told. I was just told that he was delayed on a parish matter.
I think we'll revert to this at the end of the roll call, and members can then vote on whether or not to mark him as excuse or not.
Madam Deputy Feltham.
Present.
Madam Deputy Kovac.
Malade.
Oui, j'aurais que Madame Deputy Kovac est tellement indisposée qu'elle ne peut pas assister aux états sans disposer sa santé.
Les états sont constitués, as it's a matter for the Assembly to decide whether or not a member is excused in their absence. We'll return to the situation with Deputy War. If you can offer no more information. So he's dealing with a parish matter and will arrive when he can.
Mum, I think what he said is that it was to do with the Roads Committee, but he didn't give any detail around that.
I know the constable's here, Mum.
Deputy Hiller-Hegra.
I believe that maybe the Roads Committee is actually at 9:30 on a Wednesday morning, and the Constable may be able to confirm that, but the rest of the state's St Helier deputies are here, so I personally don't think it's right that that's an excuse to not be here.
If members would like to indicate then if they wish to mark the deputy as excuse.
Can we have the appel, please?
The appel's been called for. Members are invited to their seats.
Could I ask the defo on Deputy Porry to be raised?
Yes, indeed.
And Deputy Moore, if she's
And
walking as well.
Deputy Moore. So if members are in their seats, the vote is whether or not to mark Deputy War as excuse, and I ask the greffier to open the voting.
Sorry. So, excuse me, can we say put?
Ooh. If you're in favour, then vote for. If all members have had an opportunity to cast their vote, I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce the proposition has, well, the proposition has been rejected. There were, sorry, Deputy Greffier, all right. There were 10 votes pour and 32 contre and 1 abstention. So Deputy Watt is marked on defo. Very well, we return to the agenda, and the first item this morning is the draft Sorry, Deputy.
If I may interject, as of yesterday, I did forewarn members.
Yes, sorry, Chair, I completely forgot.
No problem.
Chair of PPC.
Thank you very much. Yes, I forewarned members that I would be proposing an extension to the sitting tomorrow evening from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. with a break between 5 and 5:30 and 6. I know that Deputy Ballot has withdrawn P14, but I still believe that it will be necessary to have that extension, and I would like members' support. Thank you.
Is that proposition seconded? Yes. Does any member wish to speak on the proposition that we stay late tomorrow? Deputy Miller.
Thank you. Ma'am, could I just suggest that if we do, I'm not opposed to staying late on Thursday, but can I suggest that if we're staying late, it's on the basis that we're going to finish on Thursday? Because if we're likely to go into Friday, then there's not much point staying on Thursday night. And we'll aim to finish on Friday.
Deputy Porray.
Thank you, ma'am. I was just going to suggest if we're going to stay on Friday, I would rather be late on Thursday and still have to do a bit more on Friday. I don't know. Rather than to stay behind on Friday evening. Thank you.
Deputy Farnham.
I hate to pour cold water on things, but I think if we're going to finish on Friday, we're going to need to sit Thursday evening looking at the order paper, so I support it.
Deputy Alves.
Thank you, Mum. I just wanted to kind of reiterate that. Fridays are our normal continuation days, and the reason for sitting later on a Thursday would be to ensure that we got everything done. I mean, ideally, we would like to finish early on a Friday, but that's not the reason for sitting later. Friday is a normal continuation day in our diaries. Thank you, Mum.
Deputy Binney.
I suggest that we cut our lunch breaks down to an hour to the...
Deputy Tadier.
If it's helpful, I will be moving my P48 use of cash in Jersey to the sitting of the 24th. So it's currently listed for the end of the order paper. So that may help members in their considerations. But I think sitting on Thursday late would be probably sufficient time to get through all the business, given the fact that the big debate perhaps that's coming up has also been deferred.
Deputy Luce.
I just want to concur with Deputy Binney. I think before we start impinging on members' evening time, we are all in town for state sittings, and we should be shortening lunch breaks before we extend into the evening.
Listen, Saviour.
As the old saying goes, Mum, work expands to fill the time available. May I suggest respectfully that we request that members reduce their speeches from 15 minutes to 10?
Well, there's plenty of alternative suggestions on the table, but the proposal by the chair of PPC was to stay until, the proposal from the chair of PPC was to stay late until Thursday. Does any other member wish to speak on that proposition? Deputy Ward.
Thank you, Mum. I think it's a sensible decision to stay late on Thursday. If we have time, as Deputy Howes has said, on a Friday to finish, then we will need to finish. And looking at the order paper, even with those things not on the order paper, there's an awful lot to cover. Just wonder whether the chair of PPC can give us the odds on us finish on a Friday. I know he has some knowledge of that, I think.
Deputy Alex Curtis.
Thank you, Mum. Could the chair, after this vote I'm supporting, maybe also propose what Deputy Tom Binney said and propose another vote on 1 hour lunches?
Does any other member wish to speak on the proposal to stay late on Thursday? If not, close the debate. Call upon the chair to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am. Interesting debate. Obviously, on the lunch breaks, which was mentioned by Mr. Deputy Bennett and Deputy Curtis, we have sent out a survey, and I hope that most members have managed to respond to it for the last sitting, where there is the possibility of reducing the lunch breaks to avoid any late sittings. But in this instance, we only have tomorrow to go, and I think it would be the most sensible thing to stay late tomorrow, even accepting that Deputy Tadier has deferred P48 and reducing speech times, I think, is inappropriate at this juncture. So, Ma'am, I maintain my proposition and call for the appel. Thank you.
Very well, the appel is called for. So members in favour of staying late tomorrow evening should press for.
Appel, please.
The appel's been called for. And I ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have now cast their vote. I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And the proposition to stay late has been adopted. 36 votes pour, 4 votes contre, and 1 abstention. Chair, did you want to make a second proposition about the lunch hours?
No, Ma'am, not at this juncture, no.
Fine. Very well, then we resume public business. The first item is the draft Sexual Offences Jersey Amendment Law 2000, P5 of 2026, lodged by the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs. The main respondent is the Chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel, and I ask the greffier to read the citation.
Draft Sexual Offences Jersey Amendment Law 2000, a law to amend the Sexual Offences Jersey Law 2018 to include additional offences committed using technology, to amend the offence for sexual grooming of a child and to make other amendments related to sexual offences. The states, subject to the sanction of His Most Excellent Majesty and Council, have adopted the following law.
Minister.
Thank you, Ma'am. In 2023, when the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force published their report, they shone light on the experience of victims and survivors. Their findings highlighted that more can be done to protect victims of crime and bring perpetrators to justice. I know that the testimonies of the women who contributed to this work moved many members of the Assembly. That is why we decided to make the delivery of the task force's recommendations a core priority for this term of government. A crucial part of this work is reforming our legislation. We need to introduce new powers for the police and courts so that they can provide a meaningful protection for victims. Where there are gaps in a statute book, we need to create new offences that better capture the harmful behaviours we are seeing. To this end, I've lodged 5 laws with the Assembly. This package of legislation aims to improve the ability of the criminal justice system to address the crimes associated with violence against women and girls. They create a robust framework for responding to intimate image abuse, harassment and stalking, domestic abuse, strangulation, and threats of sexual harm. My proposal to introduce these new laws comes at a time when the criminal justice system is under significant pressure. It would therefore be irresponsible to introduce this legislation without considering its financial impact. In an effort to support states members to make an informed decision, I have reissued each of the propositions with updated estimates of the anticipated costs of this legislation. It is important that members understand these figures in the right context. These costs may seem to some to be particularly high. That is not because these laws are unusually expensive. Rather, it is because introducing new legislation is a very expensive exercise, and the cost of doing so has rarely been set out as plainly as it is here. And it is because these laws are coming at a time when the criminal justice system is already under significant strain. Historically, governments have pushed through new legislation with an expectation that the justice system will be able to absorb the resulting cost, with little clarity on the financial and resourcing impact this has. The system cannot continue in this way. This approach is precisely why we have reached absorption capacity. We cannot expect our justice system to effectively operate new legislation without proper funding. That is why I have sought to be more transparent about the actual resource and cost implications of these new laws, because our system will not be able to operate these laws effectively unless it is resourced to do so. In total, this package of legislation is estimated to cost between 3 and 5 million per year. That is the cost of all 5 laws. To put these costs into context, I've asked officers to provide some indication of how much it costs to operate other pieces of legislation. Analysis by the States of Jersey Police has indicated the implementation of the Misuse of Drugs Law costs the force on average $530,000 per year. But the main cost, ma'am, from this legislation is to the prison. The housing of prisoners convicted under the Misuse of Drugs Law costs the prison service approximately $2 million per year. Therefore, it costs the police and the prison over $2.5 million per year to implement the Misuse of Drugs Law. If I had been able to include the costs of the Law Officers Department and the courts, this figure would undoubtedly be even larger. This is all to say that this new package of legislation is not particularly expensive. Rather, members are not usually exposed to such a robust level of financial impact analysis when they consider proposals to introduce new law. Now that the cost of this legislation has been put into context, I will turn to the principles of the proposed legislation. The first of these laws is the amendment to the Sexual Offences Law. This law is designed to address different forms of intimate image abuse and strengthen the existing offence of sexual grooming of a child. The term intimate image abuse refers to forms of abuse that make use of images where a person is depicted as engaging in sexual activity or in the nude. Unfortunately, this form of abuse is becoming increasingly common. We have all seen the news stories of so-called revenge porn, where a person has shared an intimate image of their ex-partner online, out of malice. We have heard the testimonies of young people who participated in the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force research, who described nudes being spread around school. Some of us will know victims of cyberflashing, where a person has been sent a pornographic photo against their wishes. Increasingly, we are hearing about how deepfake AI technology is being used to fake extremely lifelike images that show a person engaging in sexual activity or in a state of undress. Members may have seen the recent story in the media that raised concern about nudification websites that allow you to upload a photo of any person and then digitally undress them. Sextortion scams are also becoming increasingly common. Often this takes the form of a blackmailer that poses as a teenager and convinces another young person to send them an intimate image, only to then threaten to post these images online unless they comply with their demands. These are all examples of the types of intimate image abuse that this law has been designed to address. This law will afford everyone on the island protection from intimate image abuse, regardless of their age, sex or gender. It will protect the young people who are growing up in a new digital age. It will protect women, those whose ex-boyfriend is threatened to share intimate photos of her on social media. It will protect the teenage boy who has fallen victim to a sextortion scam. It would also protect the politicians and public figures whose pictures are particularly vulnerable to misuse. People from many walks of life can be affected by intimate image abuse, and this law provides protection for all of them. Intimate image abuse continues to grow as a problem, in part because the technology that assists people in perpetrating this abuse is widespread and easy to use. In 2023 alone, research shows that there was over a five-fold increase in the number of deepfake pornographic videos found online compared to 2022. This problem is not going away. That is why so many jurisdictions have introduced new, robust laws that are specifically designed to address intimate image abuse. In the last 10 years, England and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Canada and Australia have all introduced new specific intimate image abuse offences. The result is that, amongst its Commonwealth counterparts, Jersey is now unusual in not having introduced any such specific legislation. This means that our criminal justice system has been left to rely on the Article 51 offence of improper use of a telecommunications system, an outdated offence that sits under the Telecommunications Law, to prosecute perpetrators of intimate image abuse. This law was introduced in 2002, and at a time when social media was in its infancy. Facebook and Twitter had not even been created yet, and when many of the tools that are now used to perpetrate intimate image abuse had not yet been conceptualised. It is no wonder then that this offence is unable to satisfactorily address the forms of abuse we are seeing today. A key issue is that this offence does not sit under the Sexual Offences Law. This means that the victims of intimate image abuse do not have the same rights to automatic autonomy as other victims of sexual harm. We know that this discourages people from reporting. Another issue is that the perpetrators of intimate image abuse who are convicted of this offence are not recognised as sex offenders under the Offenders Law. This means that they are not subject to the same restrictions or penalties as perpetrators of other sexual harms. Our legislation has not kept pace with technological development, and I want to fix that by introducing new offences that have been designed to stand the test of time. To that end, this law inserts 7 new intimate image abuse offences into the Sexual Offences Law. I've ensured that these offences capture both cases of intimate image abuse that use authentic images and those forms of abuse that make use of deepfake AI technology. The first new offence relates to the possession of an intimate recording without the consent of the person pictured. The second is a new offence of making an intimate recording without consent. The third is a specific offence of making a sexually explicit deepfake of a person without their consent. This will criminalise the use of nudification websites and apps. The fourth is a specific offence of sharing an intimate image of someone without their consent that makes instances of so-called revenge porn a stand-alone crime. The fifth is an offence of threatening to share an intimate image. This captures sextortion scams and cases of coercive and controlling behaviour, where a partner or ex-partner threatens to share an image unless the victim complies with their demands. The sixth is a cyber flashing offence, which makes the sending of unsolicited pornographic images a crime. The final offence makes forcing another person to create or share an intimate recording a crime. Again, this offence captures cases where intimate image abuse is used as part of a wider strategy of coercive and controlling behaviour. There is also an issue with the way that voyeurism offence in the sexual offences law is constructed. This offence is intended to criminalise the act of taking non-consensual photos or videos underneath a person's clothing or of a person engaging in sexual activity. To satisfy the elements of the offence, the prosecution must prove that a perpetrator did this because they were motivated by sexual gratification. This can make prosecuting cases of voyeurism unnecessarily complicated. Firstly, it can be very difficult to prove that a person's actions had a specific motivation. And secondly, perpetrators can have a range of motivations. Some want to cause a victim distress, others want to feel powerful. In cases where there are difficulties in proving a sexual motivation, there is a risk that the actions of the perpetrator may not be found to satisfy the elements of the voyeurism offence. That means that there is a very real danger that a perpetrator could avoid justice on a technicality. We saw this exact issue play out in our courts in the recent AG versus Balasini 2026 case, where the defendant, who was on trial for 9 counts of voyeurism, tried to argue that he was motivated by disgust and loathing rather than sexual gratification. Taking an intimate image of a person without their consent is wrong, regardless of the reason behind the perpetrator's actions. I think our laws should reflect that fact. This law reforms the voyeurism offence that it rests and that the absence of consent instead of specific motivations. In the course of consulting with senior members of the criminal justice system on this law, additional issues with the sexual offences law and the protection of children were brought to my attention. The final aim of this law has been to resolve these issues. The first issue relates to the sexual grooming of a child offence in the sexual offences law. As it stands, the offence captures cases where a person meets a child of 15 or younger for the purpose of carrying out a sexual offence. The offence also captures cases where a person travels for this reason. However, the offence is narrowly defined, and this creates issues for law enforcement when an offender's behaviour falls outside of these boundaries. For example, if the child travels to meet the perpetrator as opposed to the other way round, this does not actually meet the elements of the offence. Again, in cases where a perpetrator has made plans to carry out this offence but has not yet acted on those plans, this does not meet the elements of the offence. This law amends this offence so that the police can intervene with perpetrators at an earlier stage and therefore prevent further harm to the child. The second issue concerns proceedings relating to indecent photographs of children. Under the existing Protection of Children law, in proceedings relating to any indecent photograph of a child, Article A states that a person should be considered to be a child if they appear to be under the age of 16. This does not align with international standards in this space. Children between the age of 16 and 18 also need protection. That is why the legislation in England and Wales recognises a person as a child if they are under the age of 18. Digital forensic teams in the UK have developed age recognition software that identifies indecent photographs of children under 18 without the need for manual review. Unfortunately, because of this peculiarity in Jersey legislation, our own digital forensics unit cannot use this software. Instead, these professionals must manually review the material and decide whether it meets the Jersey definition. This unpleasant task, quite understandably, takes a significant unnecessary toll on the well-being of staff. This law brings the Jersey definition back into line with international standards. It will also allow the police in Jersey to make use of the same software that is used in England and completes recommendation 18 of the scrutiny panel report on what protecting children in Jersey have from online harms. In summary, ma'am, this law introduces 7 new offences to address the growing issue of intimate abuse and strengthens existing legislation in respect of the voyeurism offence, the sexual grooming of a child offence, and provisions relating to indecent photographs of children. It is time that we modernise our legislation so that we can protect our islanders from the new sexual harms that have emerged from the digital world. This law provides that protection by introducing new offences and strengthening our existing laws. I therefore ask the Assembly to give their wholeheartedly support for the introduction of this new law. Thank you, ma'am.
Can I ask a point of clarification, if that's okay, from the Minister?
I'm prepared to give way for a point of clarification.
Yes, ma'am.
It's just, I read through this and I thought I knew the answer, but I'm not sure. These offences that are being, which I completely support, if somebody is found guilty of these offences, do they appear on the sex offenders register? I was confused by something that was said, and I may have misheard, because as the Minister knows, my hearing isn't great.
The point that the Deputy is making, ma'am, is the fact that under the current law, in relation to some of these offences, they are prosecuted under the telecommunications law, which means that that is not classed as a sexual offence, which means that the perpetrator, therefore, is not put on the sex offence register.
Deputy Scott and Deputy Miles, I saw your lights on with those for points of clarification or to make speech. And Deputy Farn. Are the principals seconded? Then the first speaker is Deputy Scott.
Thank you, ma'am, and I congratulate the Minister for bringing this work. As members may be aware, I was asked to take some ministerial responsibility in the area of online harms, and there is a cross-ministerial group that is chaired by, on behalf of the Minister of Children in response to scrutiny recommendations. But I would also like to point out, and in particularly in terms of my delegated ministerial responsibility and data protection, that online harms reaches much more beyond that. I believe that the nature of bullying and of rights to privacy need to be much better understood in this community. And the legislation deals with the use of imagery to abuse and bully people in a very specific situation. But as the Minister says, there is also a line of thinking that taking an image without consent of a person without consent is generally wrong. And then that leads to a whole discussion about, well, what about if people are in public places and all these things? Many of these matters have been considered as the government carries on working on this area, and most recently there was a consultation on online harms looking in connection with another piece of work, because sometimes the perpetrator cannot be found. they're hiding behind an identity. So I welcome, I acknowledge that there can seem a danger of this legislation seeming piecemeal. We all are dealing with it in our different areas. I also very much welcome a bit more of clarification even about the nature of stalking. People just sometimes do not understand that their behaviour isn't acceptable and it's wrong, and it's important to make that clear. So I'll be supporting the proposition, of course. Thank you.
Ma'am, may I raise the defo on Deputy Wall, please?
Members content to raise the defo on Deputy Wall? Defo is raised. Deputy Miles.
Thank you, ma'am. And I thank the Minister for bringing these pieces of legislation. No one in this Assembly disputes the seriousness of violence against women and girls, and no one questions the importance of strengthening our laws to protect victims and hold offenders to account. And I was delighted to be able to establish the VAUG task force during my time as Minister in response to a proposition from the Connaught Harbour St Martin. So the objectives of this legislation are important and in many respects commendable. They come about as a result of the VAUG task force recommendation. Ma'am, good legislation must be matched by credible, sustainable resourcing and guided by a coherent strategy. And I just want to point out that I only intend to speak once, as my comments cover this and the next 4 laws. And I specifically want to address the details contained in the financial and staffing implications of the report, which are actually replicated across all the draft laws. As we've heard from the Minister, this legislation arrives at a time when the criminal justice system is already under considerable strain. We are told that reported VAUG-related crimes have increased by 27% in the last 3 years. That increase is in many ways a positive thing. It reflects greater public awareness, increased confidence in the system, and a willingness by victims to come forward and report crimes that historically have always gone unreported. But increased reporting brings increased demand. Every report requires investigation. Every investigation requires police time and expertise. Cases must be prepared for prosecution, heard by the courts, and supported by a range of specialist victim services. And where offenders are convicted, they must be managed by the probation service or accommodated safely within the prison estate. Every stage of that process requires capacity, and we know that capacity is already under pressure. The report tells us that victim support services have already indicated that they require additional clinical leadership to ensure that the Sexual Assault Referral Centre can operate safely and in line with recognised standards. National standards may not concern our current interim Chief Executive Officer, but they concern me, and they should concern us. These services sit at the very heart of how we operate support the victims of the serious offences that these laws will create. At the same time, we're told that Lamoy Prison is operating at approximately 92% of overall occupancy. The Vulnerable Prisoner Unit, which houses most individuals convicted of sexual offences, reached full capacity earlier this year and has required temporary expansion simply to cope with demand. Even with that expansion, the unit is operating at around 95% occupancy. In practical terms, that would suggest that the system has no spare capacity. Against that backdrop, against that context, the government's own analysis estimates that the introduction of these laws could lead to between 199 and 369 additional crimes being recorded each year by the second year of implementation. The associate cost of managing that demand is estimated to fall somewhere between 3 million and 7 million annually. I noticed that the Minister referred to 5 million, but the report is quite clear, 7.9, it's nearly 8 million. These are significant operational and financial implications. Yet despite recognising these pressures, the funding model proposed does not commit resources up front. Instead, the Minister is proposing a demand-led approach in which funding will potentially be released from the Central Reserve once additional demand materialises. And it's this that makes me very uncomfortable. In other words, we legislate now and worry about the money later. And that approach might raise questions in any circumstances, but it raises particular concern in the context of Jersey's current fiscal environment. We've heard repeatedly from ministers that the island faces a challenging financial outlook. We're told that public expenditure must be carefully controlled, that the growth of the public sector must be curbed, and that government departments must improve productivity and identify efficiencies. Across the public service, we know that teams are being asked to do more with less. Recruitment is frozen. New posts are challenged. Departments are being instructed to restrain workforce growth. These pressures are real, and they're shaping the decisions we make across government. But that is why, precisely why, I think the funding approach proposed here feels so problematic. We debated the budget at the end of last year. None of this funding was included. So what the minister is effectively doing is offering for sale something we do not currently have in stock. We're being asked to approve legislation that we are told will increase demand on policing, the courts, on victim support services, and on the prison system. Yet the resources required to meet that demand are not being committed today. Instead, they're being deferred to some future process subject to future budgets, future priorities, and future financial pressures. And Ma'am, that creates uncertainty at exactly the point where certainty is needed. The police cannot recruit experienced investigators overnight once caseloads rise. Specialist victim services cannot suddenly expand clinical expertise once they're already overwhelmed. Prison services cannot rapidly create extra accommodation when population pressures exceed capacity. And where is the probation and aftercare service in all this? They are a service who specialise in working with violent offenders and sex offenders. There's nothing in any of these laws that explains the pressures on that important service or allocates resources. These systems rely on long-term planning, steady workforce development, and stable funding commitments. A reactive funding model risks creating a cycle in which services only receive additional resources once they're already under severe strain, and they are already under severe strain, and I know the Minister acknowledges that. But by that point, the consequences are already being felt in delayed investigations, longer waiting times for court hearings, and increased pressure on staff who are already working at the limits of their capacity. Ma'am, I've spent my academic career studying crime, punishment, and justice. I am a criminologist, so for me, there is a deeper issue here. What is missing from all of these propositions is a clear philosophical approach to criminal justice policy. We're being asked to consider legislation that will inevitably increase demand across the criminal justice system and potentially increase the prison population. Yet these proposals do not sit within a clearly articulated penal policy or a wider criminal justice strategy. There is no clear explanation of how these changes fit within a broader vision for our justice system. What is our long-term approach to sentencing policy? How do we intend to manage prison population pressures over the coming decade? Why are we not seeking to reduce the prison population? Where is our equal focus on safeguarding, prevention, and early intervention? What balance do we wish to strike between punishment, rehabilitation, and prevention? How do these new offences interact with our wider efforts to reduce reoffending and support victims? Now, these are not abstract questions. They're very fundamental questions about the direction of our justice system. I found out last week that the Criminal Justice Systems Board, a body who are charged with setting the strategic direction of criminal justice, have not met for a number of years. So without that strategic oversight, these laws are being created in a vacuum, and we risk creating a patchwork of legislative responses, each addressing a very important issue, but collectively lacking coherence. And when legislation is introduced in this way, the operational consequences tend to fall on the institutions that must implement it. The police, the courts, the prison service, the probation and aftercare service, and the support organisations that assist victims. These institutions need clarity, they need strategy, and they need certainty about resources. Legislation on its own does not deliver justice. Justice emerges from the combined operation of laws, just institutions, ethical values, and proper enforcement. Legislation provides only the structure. Justice depends on how these laws are interpreted, implemented, coordinated, and maintained. Justice is delivered through functioning institutions. Investigators who have the time and expertise to pursue cases properly, courts that can hear these cases without unacceptable delay, support services that can assist victims through what is often an extremely difficult process, probation services that can manage offenders safely and effectively, and custodial services that can accommodate dangerous offenders who cannot be managed safely in the community. Without the resources and planning to support these institutions, we risk creating a gap between what these laws promise and what the system can realistically deliver. And when that gap emerges, I fear that it will be the victims who will ultimately pay the price. So if we are serious about tackling violence against women and girls, and I believe everybody in this assembly is, then our response must be more than legislative. It must be strategic, it must be properly resourced, and it must be grounded in a clear and coherent vision for how we want our criminal justice system to function in the years ahead. I will, of course, be supporting the legislation today. How can anybody not support legislation that protects not only women and girls, but men and boys? But until I see that strategic clarity, and until I see a funding model that provides real certainty rather than reactive promises, I will continue to question whether the approach being proposed today is the right one. So, in a summing up, I'd be pleased if the Minister could explain how these laws fit within a clear long-term strategy for our criminal justice system, about her penal policy, and how the government will guarantee that the police, courts, probation service, prisons and victim support services will have the capacity, capability and resources required to deliver them. Thank you, Ma'am.
Deputy Farnham.
Thank you, Ma'am. We all respect Deputy Miles's knowledge and background in this area. I'm slightly disappointed at what she said, because this Assembly, this government, the previous government, has done so much to bring forward the work, I think, that was ultimately started by the Constable of St Martin's. And one of the problems we have, I think we tend to often get caught up in a spiral of chicken and egg, legislation or funding, which one first. But you have to make a start, and that's why the Minister for Home Affairs is bringing forward this legislation, because it is urgent, because it's about protecting some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I shall let the Treasury Minister respond to some of the concerns she's raised to hopefully provide reassurance, because we are prioritising this work. We will, at the next Assembly, I'm sure we'll prioritise the funding. And the funding is actually a continued growing investment in the Home Affairs estate and the criminal justice system. But we have to reprioritise, and we will be doing further reprioritisation in public expenditure, because in one side of the argument we are being heavily criticised at the level of expenditure, and in the next breath we are being told we're not spending enough money. But I remain confident that we will find the right solution, and what's happening today is an important, very big step towards that. As Deputy Miles, I'm going to speak once on all the legislation before us. I mean, there are a number of pieces being presented by the Home Affairs Minister this morning aimed at strengthening our response to violence against women and girls in Jersey. Each of these laws addresses a gap that has been identified through the work of the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force, and through listening to the experience of victims and survivors in our community. Taken together, these measures represent practical steps to improve protection and accountability. They include new law on harassment, stalking, new offences for intimate image abuse, emergency barring orders that allow someone at risk to be protected quickly, a specific offence of non-fatal strangulation, and stronger laws covering threats of sexual harm. None of this legislation on its own will end violence against women and girls, but each piece makes a clear improvement to how our justice system responds. The harassment and stalking law recognises patterns of behaviour that can cause serious fear and harm. The new offences for intimate image abuse respond to forms of abuse that are increasingly carried out online. Emergency barring orders will allow police and the courts to create space and safety for victims in the immediate aftermath of abuse. The offence of strangulation reflects a serious risk that this form of violence poses, and stronger laws around threats of sexual harm send a clear signal that such behaviour is not acceptable and will no longer be tolerated. These changes are grounded in evidence and the voices of those who have experienced abuse. The task force heard directly from women and girls in Jersey, many of whom described how gaps in the law and in the system made it harder to seek protection for justice. Our responsibility as an assembly is to respond to that evidence carefully and constructively. The measures before us are measured and carefully thought out reforms. They are designed to improve protection for victims, ensure that harmful behaviour is properly recognised in law, and help our justice system keep pace with the ways abuse can occur today. Just as importantly, these laws are part of the wider programme of work across government, the police, support services, and community organisations. Legislation is just one part of the response, but it is a necessary foundation, and I'm pleased we are laying that foundation today. I hope members across the Assembly will support this package of laws. They are practical, considered steps that will help make our island safer and ensure that those who experience abuse are better protected by the law. Thank you, Ma'am.
Deputy Miller.
Sorry, ma'am, just trying to make some notes. Ma'am, as we begin this series of debates on legislation addressing violence against women and girls, the comments I make now, in my role as Treasury Minister, will apply across the suite of legislation, and I ask members to take them as relevant to each of the individual debates that follows. I may express my own personal views on a later piece of these laws. These laws represent an important step forward in strengthening protections for all those at risk of harm, particularly women and girls who continue to be disproportionately affected by acts of violence and unwanted behaviour or contact short of violence. They introduce important new offences that better reflect the realities of modern life and close gaps in our legislative framework. Together, they will provide frontline services with stronger tools and help ensure that those who report harm can have confidence that the system is able to respond effectively. As with any significant development in criminal legislation, we should expect these measures to lead to increased reporting and, in turn, additional demand on the police and the whole of the wider criminal justice system. The level of new demand and the resource needed to respond to it is inherently uncertain. We have already seen increases in reporting linked to the Violence Against Women and Girls programme, which we hope reflects greater confidence among women to come forward. Nonetheless, it is clear that additional resources will be required to meet the likely increased demand. Deputy Miles has recognised the work being done to reduce government spending. Treasury officials have worked closely with colleagues across the criminal justice system to identify the cost estimates provided to members. While we expect costs to fall within that range, the actual level of funding will ultimately depend on the incidence and severity of cases reported once these laws take effect. Additional funding was allocated to police in 2026 budget, but it was clear that further funding would be needed, and we completely anticipated a growth bid coming forward for next year. And the budget for 2027 to 29 will need to make provision for further funding based on a demand-linked model. This will likely involve holding some resources in the Central Reserve and releasing them as needed, ensuring that services can respond proportionately to real pressures while avoiding committing funds beyond the amount that proves necessary. The next Assembly will need to decide what it wants to prioritise and whether the response to VOG is more important than other services. While these measures will require careful financial planning and monitoring, they represent an important and necessary investment in the safety and confidence of islanders. I will just add one comment now. Deputy Miles says law does not deliver justice, I think if I'm paraphrasing, and she's absolutely right. This creates laws that identify behaviour. Law does not change behaviour, and the criminal justice system is only one part of the picture. Criminal justice system will deter, it will identify, and it will punish, it hopefully will rehabilitate. But what we need is education and behavioural change, and this law may not do that. We need to recognise the impact of online harms, and these laws provide an important mechanism to deal with the behaviour as it arises. We really now need to think much more carefully on how we address and eradicate the behaviour. Thank you, sir.
On the top of St Martin.
I would like to begin by saying how pleased I am that we have such significant improvements to our legislation before us in this Assembly. The draft laws we have before us today are a vital part of making Jersey a far safer place for women and girls, and both the Assembly and this government's willingness to engage on the issue has been a major success of the last few years. When I secured the £200,000 funding to investigate violence against women and girls in the 2022 government plan, it was my hope that we could keep the conversation about the safety of women and girls at the heart of our government and politics. It is a credit to the countless people who saw the opportunity from the resulting VOG task force that we have this legislation before us today. That we make people safer, that we protect women and girls from harm is a fundamental principle that we must continue to work towards. Even with this legislation strengthening these laws, it is clear that it is not the end of the road. As we heard last week from Joyce Watson MS, Welsh Labour politician and chair of the Senedd Women's Caucus, and Anna Whitehouse, best-selling author, presenter, podcaster, and well-known flexible working campaigner at the inaugural Women's Parliamentary Caucus, there is still so much to be done to eliminate structural and gendered inequalities, be it in health, in work, or in life in general. I'm very grateful to the present Home Affairs Minister, Deputy Mary Le Hegere, and her team for prioritising this legislation, and to the two former Home Affairs Ministers, Deputy Helen Miles and Deputy Guida, and all who have helped, including the task force, law officers, police, and those who have given evidence to get us to where we are today. We know the challenges that the next Assembly will face, and sadly, we know all too well that the world has become a more reactive, more dangerous place, especially for women and girls. Even the US have been looking for ways to deny voting to married women. As I've said before, it is critical that Jersey proves an exception to this rule. Ma'am, we do not just have an opportunity to continue to progress and improve the lives of women and girls in Jersey. We have an international duty. I thank all those involved over the years, and I will be voting for this legislation, and I urge this Assembly to also vote for it. Thank you.
On the top of St Peter.
Thank you. I would like to express my strong support for this law, as it strengthens the laws in respect of young people and online harms. Just like other jurisdictions, our legislation has struggled to keep pace with the new and and emerging threats presented by online and the digital world. Particularly in the space of intimate image.
Connotab, sorry, if you could turn your fan off when you're
Oh,
speaking.
sorry.
I noticed it yesterday with some members that it does interfere
Yes,
with
you're quite right. Sorry about that. Particularly in the space of intimate images abuse in particular, it is clear our legislation has fallen behind and requires reform. There is so much work to be done to tackle issues surrounding young people's use of smartphones, social media, and ensuring the online world is a safe and positive space for our young people. The recent scrutiny review on this subject was helpful, and I thank them for their work. These collective concerns have led me to set up a cross-ministerial group to provide direction and alignment to ensure coordinated, balanced, sustainable and proportional government policy in relation to online safety, and to monitor and look for consistent improvements to those policies. The group will also have oversight and responsibility for the delivery of our actions set out in the government response to the Children Education Home Affairs Scrutiny Review on online harms for children. The group will receive advice, analysis and statistics, monitor progress and coordinate decision-making across government to oversee online safety strategic policy development and implementation of ministerial directions. As members would see from the terms of reference for the group that I've set out, introducing intimate image abuse offences is an important part of this work. It allows us to send a very clear message that these forms of abuse are unacceptable and will not be tolerated. These are new criminal offences, will act as a powerful deterrent to would-be perpetrators, providing Ireland with an additional layer of protection and creating these new mechanisms to bring perpetrators of this abuse to justice. I hope the rest of the Assembly will join me in giving their support for this crucial law. I thank you, sir. Thank you.
Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, Ma'am. I welcome this legislation and echo some of the previous thanks to the various people involved, and I think it's a credit to the Assembly that the collaborative working has got us to this point, and again I think we should be proud of that. Some of the previous speeches have raised some questions and concerns, and I think that it's okay to do so. I think we can be proud and pleased that a law is being brought forward, and we can also point out where structures around that law need to be improved in order to make it work. And I have some questions in that vein which relate mostly to children and education. And I note the Education Minister hasn't spoken yet, and actually he might wish to reflect on some of this, and he may actually be able to, he may already be doing some of this and might be able to respond to it. I read the comments from the scrutiny panel. They were very helpful, and Deputy Miles's speech contained some of the content from the panel comments. I also read the CRIA with interest, and I am grateful to the Minister that a full and detailed CRIA is attached to these pieces of legislation and really helped me forming some of my thoughts. One of the submissions to the scrutiny panel was from the Children's Commissioner, and the Children's Commissioner has recognised these draft laws as a major advancement in Jersey's approach to preventing VAUG, which is violence against women and girls, and she's also said children, and I think Deputy Miles mentioned men and boys as well, because of course it's not just women and girls. And she also concluded in her submission that VAUG is unequivocally a children's rights issue. And I wanted to help members reflect, and indeed hopefully to get some information from the Minister in her summing up about whether thought has gone into what sits around this legislation in order to help children understand it, in order to help teachers and schools understand it, and to deliver the necessary education around it to children so that they know about these new laws and that they are aware of appropriate behaviour online and how to protect themselves. And I know that significant improvements have already been made in this area because a project started by Deputy Gardner and myself, which took all of the recommendations from the Youth Assembly in regards to PSHE. That was carried forward by the current government, and I know that that is being embedded in schools. So I would welcome some comments from the Education Minister on how that's going and whether he thinks that there needs to be further updates to that, given this new legislation that we are hopefully going to be putting in place today. Does he think that the PSHE curriculum needs to further flex to take that into account? Something that was highlighted in the Minister's report to this legislation, which relates to children, and I'm not sure that the term post-separation abuse was actually used, but the report did describe how, for example, possession of intimate images can be used to coerce an ex-partner after separation, and that there's evidence that that can be used to coerce the partner into allowing contact with children in abusive situations. And that for me, I felt that is a deeply serious situation, isn't it, that is probably going on in our island at the moment. And I hope that that can be addressed with this new legislation. And I note that one of the new offences that's being created is the making possession of intimate images without consent a crime. So could the Minister just confirm that if those images were given with consent in the first instance, if the individual then withdraws a consent, say upon separation, and the other partner doesn't delete them and continues to possess them, does that constitute an offence? Can consent be withdrawn in that instance? Because I think that's probably the most common scenario, isn't it, where somebody would hold images without consent. In terms of PSHE, I was looking at the UK and Jersey and trying to compare what was the case in terms of what is compulsory in schools. And it's quite hard to understand, actually, because in the UK, they do have compulsory sex and relationships education, and in Jersey there are, I think, topic areas within that schools must teach, but I'm not sure that the actual content is compulsory. And again, I'd just be interested to hear some reflections on that and whether that needs to evolve further. And what support do we need to give to parents to understand what's being taught in schools? And obviously we need to support teachers to do that and make sure that the resources are there, potentially maybe outside resources going into schools to help them teach these subjects might be welcomed, in the same way that we did after the care inquiry, when I asked the Chief Minister at the time for funding for the NSPCC Pants campaign, which is a primary school education programme that teaches children about bodily autonomy and boundaries and consent in an age-appropriate way. And that was embedded in our primary schools at the time to great effect. It's very, very effective. I think I would like to see that carried out again, actually, because obviously the time has passed since then, and I think that would be a really effective complement to this suite of legislation. Because when we look at the research on actually what age children need to be learning about consent and learning about appropriate online behaviour, it's a lot younger than we think. Some of the most robust data sets are actually for England. We do have some data in Jersey, but in the UK, the Office of the Children's Commissioner there has found that the average age of first exposure to pornography is 13 years old, but actually nearly a third of children had seen pornography before they left primary school, and 10% by age 9. So we mustn't be scared of having conversations with children in an age-appropriate way to help protect them from these things it's the culture that we're kind of swimming around in, isn't it? It's the technology is there, and we can protect children as much as we can, but we can't always prevent some of these things happening, and we must. It's really important that we empower our children, that they can understand how they can get help, how they can protect themselves, and ultimately we should be protecting them, shouldn't we, with our policies and with the education that we give them. And if we look at older children, again, some of the data sets talk about
girls feeling pressured to send sexual images of themselves. So it's not just the accidental exposure or the viewing online pornography. Children are being pressured, sometimes by peers, sometimes by adults, into making explicit images of themselves. And I think as an assembly, we're learning about coercion, aren't we, and emotional abuse, and the hidden ways that actually people can be influenced and kind of emotionally forced to behave in a certain way. And we must continue having those conversations in schools, in the assembly, in the island, as to where that occurs, why it occurs, and how to prevent it, and kind of bring those issues out into the light, as it were, so that they are not so hidden. The Children's Commissioner submission recommended child-centred guidance for the criminal justice system, and I wondered if the Minister had had a chance to reflect on that, and if she could respond to that, because in the same way that the funding and the resources that Deputy Miles talked about need to be there, I think it's really important that the guidance for the criminal justice system is there from the beginning, so that children are genuinely being served and that a trauma-informed approach is being taken. And that involves the appropriate training as well for individuals within the criminal justice system. And I note that at the most recent VORGA update, I think training around coercion still hadn't been carried out. So that is a concern of mine, which I would like the Minister to address. And if it is still an outstanding issue, how does she think that the next government could address that and make sure the correct training and the correct guidelines and guidance are in place, so that this legislation can be applied in a child-centred manner, which of course would tally up with the UNCRC. I think that's everything I had to say, sir, but I do welcome this legislation, and I hope that it can actually be used in practice wherever it's necessary, in a way that is child-centred. But also I hope that we can prevent the need to use it by the appropriate education in schools. I think that's more important, isn't it, the prevention. This legislation that we're debating today is the worst case scenario, isn't it? And I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that prevention is really important, and that comes through schools. It also comes through cultural conversations, parents being able to talk to their children. One final thing, if schools are being given resources, how also can parents be educated, and resources for parents are also important, so that they don't feel they want to withdraw children, and so that they know how to have those backup conversations at home, and culturally we can continue to evolve and move forwards, and reduce ultimately rates of violence against women and girls and all individuals in Jersey. But I'm very grateful to the Minister. I'll obviously be supporting the legislation.
Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, ma'am. I've asked for the panel's comments papers to be reissued in order to assist members. Speaking on the draft sexual offences amendment law specifically, the panel is very supportive of the new offences and other changes in this law. So firstly, as part of this law, there is the offence related to the sexual grooming of a child. There was a gap in the law which will now be covered, helping to ensure that perpetrators can be prosecuted. The panel also recommended in our review of online harms that the Protection of Children Law 1994 should be amended so that the age limit is changed from under the age of 16 years to under the age of 18 years, which I remember the Minister referred to in her opening speech. As well as improving safeguarding, this change will bring Jersey into line with many other jurisdictions, such as the UK. Currently, the cut-off at 16 has meant that software available to police forces in the UK that automatically scans images of under 18s cannot be used in Jersey, meaning images have to be individually looked at, which has been very time-consuming. So we're very pleased to hear this is one of the changes covered in the draft Sexual Offences Amendment Law. Although these changes are part of the VORG legislation, it applies to everyone, men, women, and children. Children can be direct victims of these types of violence and behaviour, or indirect victims as witnesses. As for intimate image abuse, I think it goes without saying that it's a good thing to try and make it more possible for the removal of intimate images, as is removing the motivational threshold relating to sexual gratification for the voyeurism offence. Online harms are only going to increase, unfortunately, and I'm hopeful that the recommendations from the panel's online harms review will be developed into the next assembly. And there is a lot more that can be said on this matter, but I think it's best to stay on subject. But some concerns remain. Firstly, the panel has requested that guidance, including a directive from the Attorney General, should be developed in relation to how children will be dealt with and where they are subject to the draft laws. Secondly, and I acknowledge that the Minister has explained the costs of implementation and that there has been more said in previous speeches, but the panel remains unsure about the readiness of services, bearing in mind the extra resource required. The police already have an enormous amount of work to do in the digital forensics unit. Support services for victims will require more resource, and the prison may well require some extra capacity. Therefore, we are concerned that there is not the necessary structure in place to support the implementation of the amendment law at this stage, and I ask the Minister to address this matter in her closing speech.
Mr. Attorney General.
Ma'am, thank you. Given that the debate has ranged across the considerations of the wider justice system born of these provisions, it seems to me appropriate if I address the Assembly briefly. In terms of pressure on the Royal Court, in fact, the Royal Court is responding very well and will, I'm confident, respond very well to the workload that these new laws bring about. As matters presently stand, cases appearing for the first time now for first hearing in the Royal Court are being listed for trial within this year. So no one, whether that's a defendant or complainant, is waiting more than a year, and often they're waiting rather less than that, from first appearance in the Royal Court until trial. That compares with, in England, a wait of something now in the order of 4 years between first appearance and trial. The Criminal Justice Systems Board has been mentioned. It has met under the new bailiff. It has agreed to a programme to implement the proposals in the Laws Review and is fully committed to that, as indeed is my department. Guidance about the treatment of children in the justice system in light of these laws is under consideration as well. I hope those observations are of some comfort and assistance to members.
Mr. Attorney. Conataba St Saviour.
Thank you, Mum. I will be supporting this proposition, Mum. I know an awful lot of work has gone into it, and I really appreciate it. I just have a query regarding online images. I wonder if the Minister could help when she's summing up. That I think people seem a bit lost and obviously very embarrassed and intimidated if something comes up online that's, shall we say, pretty unsavoury. How do they go? Where do they go? Many of these servers are off island and indeed in other countries. I think people would appreciate a flow chart. Just say, if you find something online, this is where you go. You know, do people go to the police? Do people go to telecoms or the states? I think people would appreciate a simple flow chart action that can be taken. Thank you, Ma'am.
Deputy Rob Ward.
Thank you, Ma'am. I think Deputy Dublé, because I was wondering what I was going to say. There's so much here that's given me a bit of direction, which I'll cover in a minute. I'll start off, Ma'am, when we talk about money. I will make one point on this. This is the dichotomy we have in this Assembly, for an Assembly that constantly talks about cutting back public service, constantly talks about austerity and spend, but wants these world-class services which are invaluable to a society that we all want to live in. And so there is a dichotomy there, Mum, and there is an election coming up. Perhaps we all need to address that dichotomy in the next election when we talk about our policies on collecting money and taxation. But we move on. Mum, let me talk about education, and I agree. I know about PHSE. We were in the Curriculum Council. I was also, for my sins, Mum, I've taught a number of PHSE lessons, always older students, don't know why, and I really enjoyed them. They were astounding lessons, Mum, even if I say so myself. And one of the issues around PHSE is exactly those things that we've talked about. What content, and that word content is a really difficult word in PHSE because it's not the delivery of content. It is as much as anything the delivery of discussion and an open forum to discuss issues that are there. And this is about a cultural change. And I'll say this at the beginning. There are a number of responsibilities here. Men in their actions have responsibility. I and every man on this island and every man on this planet has responsibility in the actions that they take towards women and girls and what they see as what is right and what is wrong. And I don't, Mum, just say that because I am the father of a daughter. I say that because I'm also the father of a son, and because I've taught for many years, and because I'm a member of our society, and I hope I'm a decent member of our society. And so that's a really important point. There's responsibility in those who feed division in our society, because it is division that feeds misogyny. And it is that division in our society that we must address whenever we see it. But to get back to the PHSE point, I absolutely agree with the Deputy when she talks about the importance of the UNCRC that we have signed up to, and most importantly, the voice of children. And we must listen to voices of children in this arena. What is the understanding of children? I will say though, Mum, that we cannot leave this all to PHSE teachers. Of course it's important. Of course the delivery of education is important, but schools cannot be the solution to every single problem that we have. And indeed, Mum, when schools address these really difficult issues, they get thrust into the realms of the political, and we end up discussing those issues in this assembly, which can sometimes be extremely damaging for members of our community. So we have to be incredibly careful when we do that. There is an issue, Mum, that I think does need to be taught, and that word taught is a very strange word. When I say taught, I'm not talking about, I think it's called didactic teaching, where you stand in front and lecture. I'm talking about that discussion, that modern education, which is about involving young people. For example, around toxic influences, particularly male toxic influences that seem to be impinging upon our society and some young men. And we have to address those issues. But when they are addressed, Mum, I say again, we cannot draw teachers into the world of politics and say, you are responsible for something they are not, when all they're doing is discussing. One of the things in schools, for example, we talked about this, about roles in schools. Now, it was mentioned, and I don't know whether people will agree with this, but I'll make my point clear on this. It was suggested, or perhaps what you need to give is a responsibility point for VORG in every school. My answer to that is no, I don't think we should, because this is not the responsibility of one individual in a school. This is a cultural change across all of our education system about the way in which we address violence against women and girls in our schools and in our society. And we have those difficult conversations. Calling a group of boys out in the corridor to say your behaviour is inappropriate there towards that person, it should be done. And if it causes conflict in schools, which it can do, it needs to be addressed. But then what do we do to support our staff when complaints are made about them calling these things out? And we get drawn, our staff in our education system get drawn into the world of politics. So this is a very difficult thing. If you want educators to do this job and allowing children to have a voice, you need to allow them to do that job without interference. Mum, some examples, I was very privileged actually to be invited to the Unleashed Voices event at JCG an evening a few weeks ago, where young women at JCG with poetry, music, recitals on exactly this issue, and I was genuinely privileged to be there. There were also boys from other schools there too who participated, which I was really pleased to see. No, Mum, there were young men from other schools there. That's a better phrase. and they take their responsibility seriously about those relationships that they have, and that's a really important thing for us to do. Ma'am, I also think that the media has a responsibility, a huge responsibility here, in the way in which they behave. And a question for the Minister, perhaps. This is not as, well, I don't know, it's an impossible thing for me to say now, but it's not as serious as the offences mentioned in this law, which I fully support this law, by the way. But I, Ma'am, would think it would be a really, really positive move and support for this type of law and others if our media made very clear on their front pages and on their sites that they will not reproduce AI images that are fake images in order to sell newspapers or to sell their websites. And recently that has happened. And the power of our media saying, we will not engage ourselves in fake AI images. We will report that it's happening, fine. We will talk about the damage it does to people, but we will not show those images. So they will not be fed by us. I would make a plea to the media outlets to do that. That's the type of cultural and society-wide responsibility that we all take. Don't share them, don't look at them. Sometimes it might be, if you're looking at media from around the world at the moment, it's really quite scary. You don't know what's true and what isn't. Because all of those images, Ma'am, and I take this from the law itself and the plan, have a level of humiliation, impact on mental health, emotional well-being, and so any of those images do that, and I think we all have a responsibility. And Ma'am, I'm pleased to see the clear message of zero tolerance that these laws take. That's exactly what we need to have. There is zero tolerance in the sharing of images of the types that we've said, of online abuse that we've said. And that, actually, I would say to Deputy Doumblet, Ma'am, that this law really does help the PHSE because it means there is a clarity of what can be delivered, perhaps for the first time ever. And I think, as I've said before, you have to skirt around the issues. What can I say? What can't I say in this? This is clear. There is a clear law here, Ma'am, which is a welcome, like the discrimination law is welcome, so we can talk about that, and I think we can move forward. So I welcome these laws. I thank the Minister and all the previous ministers that have been involved in these, and I know there is a general acceptance of these. But I'll finish, Ma'am, by saying again, we all have a responsibility here to make cultural change. And unless we support that and we engage ourselves in that, it won't just be a law that does that, it'll be the actions that we take. And yes, it will need to be paid for, like so many other things, if we want the sort of society that we all want to live in. Thank you, Ma'am.
Did the Minister give way for a point of clarification? No, I did ask a lot of questions. I wondered if the NSPCC Pants campaign, if there was any consideration of that being run again in schools.
Yeah, thank you, Ma'am. I'm not sure it ever stopped. I would check. I'm pretty sure. But the NSPCC also have a new online campaign that is very, very good. And, of course, the name of it has gone right out of my head immediately. But, yes, absolutely. And the NSPCC have been incredibly supportive of education. There's a really good relationship here. So, yes, I'm sure I can reassure the Deputy that those things will happen. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Gorst.
Thank you, Ma'am. I just wanted to really pick up on some of the things that Deputy Miles said in her speech, which I thought was excellent. Because, as the Chief Minister said, sometimes we cannot do things because we haven't got everything in order and we haven't got every policy developed, we haven't got every pound allocated. And that, of course, would be a shame. And the issues that she articulated so well in her speech were issues that were the subject of conversation around the Council of Ministers table. The importance of bringing in the legislation, but also the importance of the wider strategy. And it's not just a criminal justice strategy, as other members have started to talk about. It's a wider societal issues that we will need to address and consider. And I know the Education Minister thinks that his schools are an easy target to say schools can solve all of our problems. And he's absolutely right to remind us that they cannot. They are an important partner with parents and the rest of society. And I think we are, and I hope we are, getting to the point where we're seeing other jurisdictions make difficult decisions around child protection, about what happens with smartphones. Is it really feasible that a small jurisdiction like Jersey can impose regulation on some of the large tech companies? And the reason I raise these issues is because they're core to what is available in our society, and whether for children they can accidentally fall upon images, even with the best controls. And we've got to admit, as Deputy Curtis and her panel showed, we don't yet have the best controls available to us in Jersey. These are difficult technical issues, and they will require a wider societal conversation, because we can't get away from the fact that these crimes are being committed in our community. As much as we might like to think they're not, they are. And therefore, as one part of our armoury, we need to be able to challenge those crimes and prosecute them and see people brought to justice. And therefore, Council of Ministers, in its deliberation about, well, how much is it going to cost? Have we got all of the preventative work in place? Have we got enough resource? The answer as we sit here is we know that we haven't. We know that work is being undertaken, as the Attorney General reminded us, and as no doubt the Minister will remind us in her summing up. So this is one part of a much wider picture, which this Assembly won't be able to deal with, but the next Assembly in the next parliamentary term will need to deal with. And I don't think there's ever been any indication that we would just have this legislation and that would be fine. No, it's got to be a joined up strategy and policy and a wider societal conversation about how we protect the most vulnerable, which is in this case is children, or those being made to suffer these criminal actions. And so I support the Minister in bringing forward all of these pieces of legislation. And as the Treasury Minister said in her comments, Treasury will work with the Department for Justice and Home Affairs into the future to make sure that there are appropriate resources in place so that we can have this wider strategy that is ultimately required. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak on the principles? If no other member wishes to speak, I close the debate and I call on the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am, and I thank all of those that have spoken within the Assembly on this matter. Firstly, I'll try and address the issues that were raised by Deputy Miles, issues that it will be no surprise to most that I've highlighted over the last 2 years, Ma'am, as in that there was already an increase in reporting of the violence against women and girls, and clearly systems were under strain. That is why, in actual fact, that I pushed hard and strong on actually bringing the financial package with this legislation. Because what I've watched over the last nearly 8 years now is that we've brought through legislation without any idea what it's all going to cost. And what that has meant is that some departments have ended up with lots of rules and regulations, lots of laws, and then people say, well, what have you done about implementing them? What are your staff doing? And we continue also to make savings and cut costs. And those things do not match up. So when we accepted all of those recommendations for the violence against women and girls, there was legislation that was in that package. I started to have discussions very early doors within the staff in the Treasury about resourcing and the implications of that. And they rightly said to me, you know, with new laws, this is the correct way to do it. This is the way that we should always be doing it. We should always be saying, when we bring legislation to the Assembly, it's the same as propositions, ma'am, in a way, we should always be saying, what is the cost? And so that is what we've done. And I'm very grateful to the Treasury team and to the various organisations about the amount of time which is actually taken to try and analyse and get a picture of how much this could potentially cost. There was talk about the probation and after services, there's been talk about the prison. All of those groups have been having some discussions with the Treasury. Obviously, the court processes, the legal advisors department and probation come under what we call non-ministerial, as opposed to having ministers. But they are all part of the equation. And I think it will be important for members in this Assembly to identify that things will cost money if we want to progress. So that is why we are here. The question was, why wasn't it in the budget? It's taken 2 years, probably longer than I anticipated, but it's taken a long time to actually get the legislation together, alongside me continually asking for those financial costings to be made. And that has been a significant amount of work. So that is why we weren't really able to provide necessarily the costs and weren't really able to within the previous budget. But what is also critical here, this isn't about necessarily being able to say that it's already, things are already up, but this is about actually identifying what could happen in relation to the law that we are now looking to introduce. Not what's happened in the past, because we can't fix all of that necessarily, but what we need to do is when we move forward and hopefully approve all of this legislation, we need to know that what we're going to do next. So that is why it is on a phased approach. There is a significant cost to all of this. Make no bones about that. That is a fact. So that is why it has been phased, because we need to be sure as to how the increase is going to be. It is analysis based on other jurisdictions. It has been analysis based on what's happened in the last couple of years here in Jersey. But it's important that we don't say we need this money and we need all of this now, because nobody in this room, I'm sure, would think that we can suddenly recruit all the people that we need, make sufficient facilities at the prison and do all of this at once, because realistically that is not possible. So that is why we are in a phased approach. In relation to the other matters, in relation to prevention, and there are quite a lot of things that have already been done. There's been intervention in relation to training for professionals, education for young people, awareness campaigns for the public, etc. Prevention in a huge part of work in relation to the alongside the legislation and its support. In relation to the probation service, as I said, officers are working with the probation service in relation to building healthy relationships programme for the prison, alongside of the prison. The other thing that the Deputy Miles mentioned was the Criminal Justice Board. You should be pleased to know that the board did actually meet for the first time on the 11th of February and have agreed a programme to implement the recommendations of the Laws Review alongside other matters. So that board has now started to meet under the new bailiff. Deputy Ward has already mentioned about the education, but I would just like to run through quickly so that for all of the other pieces of legislation. There's a toolkit for secondary schools in relation to the whole approach of violence against women and girls. The PSHE has been updated about sex and healthy relationships, piloting a toolkit and education programme in relation to primary schools, tailored for age-appropriate content, the training of the teachers, bystander training for teachers to challenge inappropriate or problematic behaviours, working with students to develop bills of rights on what behaviour is acceptable, understanding some secondary schools such as JCG and Vic have already done this work. Schools are now assessed on their delivery of VORG education through the schools review framework and the annual safeguarding audit. A full review will be done as requested by the Constable of St Martin's during the budget, so that whole report will be issued before the end of this term of office. The Attorney General has already mentioned about what their department is doing. In relation to the question asked by Constable Lewis, this is actually part of the broader piece of work that's going on across ministerial. But in relation to what he said this morning, I think if somebody finds themselves in relation to finding themselves on social media, which they haven't consented to in relation to images, then that is a matter that I would suggest that they report to the police. And then therefore, from then on, they can provide the necessary advice and guidance. In relation to the point made by Deputy Dublé, if there was something that was on previously had been consented to, if somebody withdraws that consent, then it is necessary for that to be removed. So anyone can remove consent even though they have previously acknowledged it. And hopefully, Ma'am, I have addressed all of the concerns that people may have. It is, maybe we could say, is it the cart before the horse? However, we need to start somewhere, and I think it's important that these laws get passed in order that we can maybe as well make sure that the laws actually fit the purpose as to what society is today. And I move the proposition, Ma'am.
Do you ask for the appel, Minister?
Yes, please, Ma'am.
Very well, the appel has been called for. I ask members to return to their seats. And I ask the greffier to open the voting. If all members have had an opportunity to cast their vote, I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce the principles have been adopted, 46 votes for and no votes contrary. How do you wish to propose the articles, Minister?
En bloc, please, Ma'am.
Do you wish to speak to them?
I won't. I'll ask members if there's anything in particular that they have any concerns, because there are quite a number of articles, so I think I've given quite a comprehensive speech, but if anybody wants me to outline anything or answer any questions, I'm happy to do so.
D. Andrews.
Thank you, Ma'am. No, I thank the Minister for bringing forward these 5 pieces of legislation. A couple of weeks ago, I took a bit of time out to read the 5 propositions, and in particular, I paid close attention to some of the articles. Just looking at Article 33B, and also this has been mentioned several times in other articles further down. Under Section B, it states, the person does not reasonably believe that the other person consents to the possession. And immediately when I read that, I was a bit concerned, because it's almost as if we're giving the perpetrator of a crime the opportunity to defend themselves. And just in terms of when I was looking at the wording, I thought it was probably more appropriate that we pay more attention to the victim of the crime, who should be given the opportunity to say, well, hang on a minute, I never consented to this, and here I am raising a concern about somebody sharing potential videos or images of me. And so I would have really have liked to have seen that be incorporated in some of the articles, because I think we've really got to understand here some of these, some of the victims who go through something such as videos or pictures being shared online. They go through an ordeal, and it's something for some individuals they'll probably never recover from. They are probably in this position where, in some cases, they didn't even realise that they were being filmed or that photos were being taken of them. And so to all of a sudden face this situation where they may have been informed that images or videos have been uploaded is something that I really would struggle to comprehend how people would contend with that, because it really is a violation of a person's right to maintain their dignity. And so that section B, has been quite consistent throughout the law. And I'd just really like the Minister to comment on why the wording is as it is. Also looking at Article 33C, making intimate recording without consent. Under Section 2, a person commits an offence if the person operates equipment with the intent of using that equipment to commit an offence under paragraph 1. Now, I think that's quite an important area, because somebody potentially could be informed that another person has the intention to share or create images potentially of another person. And so when Deputy Miles was speaking about interventions, I think probably what would form part of a decent strategy is about making people aware of some of the potentialities that could happen. And it's also important to make sure that the appropriate things are reported at the right time. So I think that is a very good area within that specific article, because I think it strengthens it. I also am pleased to see that there is coverage for medical professionals. Once I had a medical issue, and I had medical staff who unfortunately had to take pictures of me, but they had to share it with colleagues because they had to update one another. And so I think it's important that those medical professionals, they are protected. And the other thing as well, there's also mention of law enforcement also being covered. You know, obviously it's a frontline service, and sometimes police officers might have to do things that could potentially be very unpleasant. But of course, if they have to gather evidence, sometimes they could find themselves in a very compromised position. So I'm very pleased to see there is coverage with this in the law. So thank you, Ma'am.
Deputy Scott.
Thank you, Ma'am. It's just a point to do with the nature of much of this discussion is very much, as it should be, on the victims of you know, these offences. It gives them a certain amount of power, and I will just put it out there that one thing that also needs to be protected is that potential of power being abused in another way. We often come across people who are in relationships, they go wrong, and there can be an element at times of retaliation, which is a form of bullying and indeed another form of abuse. So the point I wish to make here is that administrative justice and how it is administered, how it's performed, how investigations are done, are really important from both sides. And it is again an area that I believe as an assembly we are exploring. We've explored in terms of administrative service, justice in terms of the Ombudsman, but I just want to say it's also an area that I may have been exploring in this area. And in response to the previous speakers, the matters that he's raised, yes, all matters need to be investigated in a way that's fair to all parties. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak on the articles? If no other member wishes to speak, I close the debate and I call upon the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am. I take the point that Deputy Andrews makes, but reasonableness is obviously a test for the court. Defendants in a criminal case do get the right to defend themselves. If the victim says that they didn't consent, that is evidence in the case that will obviously be tested by the court and treated in that manner. And I wonder whether, Ma'am, it would be appropriate at this stage if I could ask the AG to actually maybe explain the defences and how they work in order that may help other members within the Assembly, Ma'am.
Mr. Attorney, are you able to assist?
Yes, if I could just have a moment. So if we look at 33B of this law, the Crown would have to prove under 1A that the person, the defendant, knowingly possesses an intimate recording or deepfake. So otherwise, in other words, they are aware of the fact that they have possession of the image. That defendant, we would then have to show, did not reasonably believe that the other person consented to that possession. The belief to be reasonable would have to be objectively reasonable. In other words, it would have to be a belief which a reasonable person could have held in all the circumstances. If the Crown proved those things, then it is on the balance of probabilities for the defendant to establish that as soon as practicable, this is under paragraph 2, becoming aware that the recording was in their possession, they took all reasonable steps to delete or otherwise dispose of the recording. I haven't looked necessarily at the other offences, but the 33B offence divides into those two sections, what the Crown have to prove, and if they prove that, what a defendant has to establish in their own defence in order to be entitled to be acquitted.
I thank the Attorney General for making that clarification. Ma'am, this law strengthens our existing law so that we are able to appropriately respond to incidents of intimate image abuse and manage perpetrators of these harms. It provides a much needed framework of protection for all islanders in the face of this new and evolving threat. And I thank members and I call for the appel in relation to the second reading, Ma'am.
Very well. The appel has been called for in relation to Articles 1 to 8. I ask members to return to their seats. And I ask the greffier to open the voting. If all members have had the opportunity of casting their votes, I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce that the articles have been adopted, 46 votes for and no votes contra. Do you wish to take the matter in third reading?
Yes, please, Ma'am.
Again, do you wish to speak?
No, Ma'am, I have nothing further to say, and I'd ask members if they wish to speak, Ma'am.
Is the matter seconded in third reading? Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Ward.
Very briefly, Ma'am, the thing I couldn't remember the name of was the NSPCC with the Safeguarding Partnership Board. It's called Be the First Filter for Younger Children and Online Harm. So I just think if any members have not looked it up, it's a very useful resource for any of your constituents. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you, Deputy. Does any other member wish to speak in third reading? If not, I close the debate call on the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am, and I thank members for their support so far, and I'll wait until the end for doing all of the necessary rounds of thanks, otherwise we'll be here for a very long time. I'd ask...
Well, this is your opportunity.
No, I meant at the end of my 5 pieces of legislation, Ma'am, because otherwise, as I said, it will be a very long day. I just ask for the appel, please.
Thank you. The appell's been called for. Members, I think, are in their seats, so I'll ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have cast their vote. I ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce that the law has been adopted in third reading, 46 votes for and no votes contra. We then move to the next item, which is the Draft Harassment and Stalking Jersey Law 2000, P6 of 2026, lodged by the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs. The main respondent is the chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel, and I ask the greffier to read the citation.
Sorry, just before we do that, I was wondering, I'll just let the Assembly know in about 20 minutes I have to leave the Assembly to attend a medical appointment with a family member. Just to let the Assembly know that.
Thank you. I'm sure the members have noted that, Deputy Greffier, if you could read the citation.
Draft Harassment and Stalking Jersey Law 2000, a law to create offences of aggravated harassment, stalking and aggravated stalking, to consolidate the new offences with the existing offence of harassment and to provide for stalking protection orders. The states, subject to the sanction of His Most Excellent Majesty and Council, have adopted the following law.
Minister.
Thank you, Ma'am. I thank members for their support and acceptance of the Sexual Offences Amendment Law, and will now move on to the second law in this package of legislation, the new Harassment and Stalking Law. The purpose of this law is to improve the way our criminal justice system responds to perpetrators of harassment and stalking, and to provide better protections for victims of these crimes. Stalking is a pattern of fixated, obsessive and persistent behaviour that interferes and intrudes into persons' lives. It can take many forms, like repeatedly sending unwanted messages, spying on a person, damaging a person's property, or even repeatedly sending a person unwanted gifts. Taken alone, each of these behaviours might not seem serious, but taken together, these acts add up to a pattern of intimidating and obsessive behaviour that can cause a victim very serious distress. 95% of stalking victims in the UK report poor mental health impacts like PTSD and depression. In Jersey, victims of stalking have shared their experiences of receiving non-stop phone calls and messages of perpetrators watching them from outside their homes and places of work, and even damaging their cars or breaking into their homes. Their experiences of stalking have had a profound impact on their sense of safety, their mental health, and their ability to go freely about their lives. When I talk about stalking, tabloid stories about obsessive and ill-adjusted strangers might come to mind, but the reality is that you are much more likely to be stalked by someone you know, and most likely by an ex-partner. In the UK, the majority of stalking offences are actually committed by ex-partners. There is a strong link between domestic abuse and stalking. A perpetrator of domestic abuse is much more likely to stalk their ex-partner after the breakdown of a relationship. That is because stalking is a way for them to continue to exert power and control after the relationship has ended. Stalking in this context is usually more dangerous than stalking that is carried out by a stranger. These perpetrators are more likely to threaten, sexually assault and physically injure their victims. The statistics are shocking. 8 out of 10 women who are stalked by an ex-partner are physically assaulted. 3 out of 10 are sexually assaulted. Stalking is a factor in 90% of cases where a woman is killed by a partner or ex-partner in the UK. Stalking is involved in 94% of homicide cases in the UK. And stalking increases the risk of intimate partner homicide by 3 times. Stalking is very clear preamble to serious physical and sexual violence. The link between stalking and homicide is evident. That is why campaigners have likened stalking to murder in slow motion, and it is why our justice system needs to be able to respond to perpetrators of stalking before their behaviour escalates into something more serious. Under our existing laws, stalking can be prosecuted under Article 6, harassment offence under the Public Order Law. There is no specific offence of stalking, because this offence is supposed to capture both harassment and stalking behaviours. But there are a number of reasons why this arrangement does not work. Our existing harassment offence is designed to capture a broad range of harassment behaviours, but it does not recognise the uniquely harmful nature of stalking. The harms created by harassment and harms created by stalking are not equal, but the penalty for perpetrators of these harms are the same, because our legislation does not recognise that stalking is more serious. The evidential test for proving this offence is also particularly high, meaning that there have been cases where stalking behaviours have not been found to satisfy the elements of the existing harassment offence. That means we have cases where perpetrators who are guilty of stalking are avoiding conviction. This problem has had a very real impact on criminal justice outcomes for stalking cases in Jersey. Between 2016 and 2021, 192 reports of stalking were made to the police, but only 2 of those reports resulted in a conviction. This is why professionals across the justice system have been calling for the introduction of a specific stalking offence for some time. Under the existing law, the law enforcement are also very limited in what they are able to do to intervene with stalkers and protect victims. Restraining orders can be used to curb the behaviour of a perpetrator, but the courts are only able to use these orders when a person has been convicted of a relevant offence. Without a relevant conviction, a restraining order cannot be issued against a perpetrator. Difficulties in prosecuting stalkers under the existing harassment offence only compound this problem. We have a system where it is extremely difficult to obtain a conviction against a perpetrator of stalking, but our ability to protect a victim from that perpetrator is reliant on obtaining a conviction against them. Legislation in the UK used to be subject to these same weaknesses: a harassment offence that did not properly recognise stalking behaviours, and a limited ability to protect victims without a stalking conviction. They have since reformed their legislation to fix these problems by introducing specific stalking offences and protective orders that do not rely on a prior conviction. Following the introduction of this new legislation, stalking and harassment now accounts for nearly half of police recorded crime in the UK that falls within the definition of violence against women and girls. In Jersey, these offences only account for 10 to 15% of police recorded violence against women and girls offences. That is not because there is a higher proportion of stalking taking place in the UK. That is because the UK has legislation that is able to properly respond to and address cases of stalking, and we do not. I believe that victims of stalking in Jersey should have the same rights to safety and the same access to protection as victims of stalking in the UK. That is why I have brought this law before the Assembly. The law serves 2 functions. Firstly, it introduces 4 new offences that more effectively capture harassment and stalking behaviours, making us better able to respond to perpetrators. The first is the new harassment offence. A person commits this offence if they, on more than one occasion, engage in behaviour which causes a victim to feel anxiety, alarm or distress. This offence lays the foundation for the other 3 offences. The second is the aggravated harassment offence. This is the harassment offence plus fear of violence. The third is the stalking offence. This is the harassment offence plus stalking behaviour. In this law, stalking has been understood as a particularly dangerous subset of harassment that involves behaviours like carrying out surveillance of a victim, intruding into a victim's personal life, or interfering in a victim's life by disrupting or sabotaging their reputation or livelihood, or endangering their safety. The final offence is the aggravated stalking offence. This is the stalking offence plus fear of violence. Now, recently this law was criticised in the media by drawing the criminal boundaries of the new harassment offence too broadly. It is important for members' understanding that this criticism is properly addressed. Our existing offence of harassment has been widely criticised for making the threshold for prosecution too high. This point was highlighted by the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force and has been shared by professionals working within the justice system time and time again. The key rationale for introducing a new harassment offence is to lower the threshold for the prosecution of this offence, and it is correct to recognise that this is what this law does. This law lowers the threshold for prosecution because the threshold needed to be lowered. But it still draws very clear lines between what behaviour constitutes harassment and should be prosecuted and what does not. There are two measures of protection against the inappropriate use of this offence. Firstly, we have included a reasonable person standard. This is a legal test that is already well established in English and Jersey law. It guards against subjective or excessive interpretations of distress and anxiety by creating an objective way to examine the accused's behaviour and asking, would a reasonable person have known that this behaviour would cause anxiety and distress? The second measure of protection comes from the inclusion of a defence for the harassment and stalking offences, that the person's behaviour was reasonable in the circumstances. Recent critique in the media has raised concerns as to whether the investigative journalists determining campaigners or frustrated parents could become criminally liable as a result of this law. I find it highly unlikely that the behaviour of any of these well-meaning individuals would be misinterpreted as unreasonable. I will now move to the second function of this law, which is to introduce a new system for earlier intervention with perpetrators of stalking and the protection of victims. To this end, this law introduces stalking protection orders. These orders grant the courts new powers to protect victims of stalking by imposing a variety of restrictions on the behaviour of a perpetrator. The purpose of these restrictions is to prevent them from engaging in further stalking behaviour and causing the victim further harm. Under a stalking protection order, the court can prohibit a perpetrator from contacting a victim or coming within a specified distance of them, engaging in further surveillance, referring to the victim on social media, alongside many other necessary measures. Such protection measures will mean the world to stalking victims. They will mean the difference between being able to move freely in their daily life and living in fear. Unlike restraining orders, these orders do not require prior conviction, so they offer much more immediate protection. The introduction of these powers will bring our courts into line with courts in the UK, who have had these powers since January 2020. Victims and survivors of stalking have called on our government to introduce stronger powers for the criminal justice system so that the law enforcement is able to protect them before the behaviour of a perpetrator escalates. This law does exactly that. Their testimonies tell of incidents where they felt their stalker acted with impunity. They felt powerless as a lack of accountability acted on, emboldened their stalker further. These orders create a clear pathway where victims are protected and perpetrators are held to account. The court will be able to order a perpetrator to stop stalking a victim. The consequences of breaching this order are severe. It is an offence that carries a penalty of up to 5 years in prison. This in itself should be enough to make perpetrators think twice about continuing their behaviour to invade the lives of their victims. I don't believe we should wait for perpetrators to cause serious harm to their victims before we can intervene. We should be able to respond at the earliest sign of stalking behaviour and provide victims with the protections they need. This is what this law is designed to help us do. I therefore ask the Assembly gives their support for the introduction of this important law, so our criminal justice system is better able to respond to perpetrators of harassment and stalking, and law enforcement can offer victims of stalking the protections they need. Thank you, Ma'am.
Are the principles seconded? Does any member wish to speak on the principles? Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, Ma'am. And I'll just speak briefly on this. The panel is supportive of the draft law. The current offence of harassment will be moved into this draft law with new offences, aggravated harassment, stalking and aggravated stalking added. Stalking protection orders will allow for early police intervention and provide increased protection for victims. The stalking offence also includes cyber stalking. Some concerns have been raised about the inclusion of anxiety as a potential harm resulting from an harassment offence. When the panel asked the Minister about this, the Minister's response was that the interpretation of the legislation is a matter for the courts, and the ongoing reporting cycle for VOG legislation will allow this aspect to be examined further in future if necessary. While supportive of the legislation, the panel raised concerns, firstly about any criminalisation of children under various aspects of the draft law, and secondly about the impact on services. The prison, the police, for example, with stalking protection orders, and the impact on support services and the law officers department. The panel is still not confident that sufficient resources are in place for the implementation of this law and asked the Minister to address this matter, as I asked in the previous debate.
Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Dublin.
Thank you, Ma'am. I had a brief point that I wish to make around the way that individuals can interact with the police in regards to this legislation, and I wondered if the Minister would agree with me that women or anyone who is a victim of stalking behaviour shouldn't feel hesitant to report these incidents, and that they should be encouraged to do so where it is causing harm. And could she confirm that the police are able to keep a record of incidents, perhaps at early stages, so that if it does escalate, that there is evidence already there, so that they can act quicker?
Does any other member wish to speak? If not, then I close the debate and I call on the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am. In relation to the matter raised by the chair of the scrutiny panel, I fully accept that there are new pieces of legislation coming through, and that there will be an impact on both resources for the police and the courts. However, I think it is important that our laws are changed in the way that is recommended in relation to both harassment and stalking, and that stalking is a separate offence and can be dealt with more severely. From the perspective, as I said, resources will be brought in as we move forward. But I think what is also important to identify here is that by early intervention by the courts in relation to stalking orders, this could have a significant impact on the results of offences further down the line. So I think if we've got early intervention, that is far better than actually not having that facility. So from that point of view, I think actually it could almost be the reverse in relation to it will stop more serious offences coming forward if we are able to actually deal with this at an earlier stage. In relation to Deputy Dublay's comment, I would say that I would encourage any victim of stalking or harassment, but as stalking is a new piece of legislation, I would encourage anybody that is a victim of stalking to report it to the police, because as we have said with a lot of these offences, we need to have a clear picture, we need positive action, and it is only by people reporting these offences and positive action being taken that we will be able to hopefully change the way that society is and that we can move forward. And I propose this legislation, Ma'am.
Those members who are in favour of the principles, kindly show. The appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. I'll ask the greffier to open the voting. If all members have had an opportunity to cast their votes, I ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce that the principles have been adopted, 34 votes pour and no votes contre. Does the chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel wish to scrutinise this matter?
That's okay.
How do you wish to propose the articles in second reading then, Minister?
On block, please, ma'am.
Do you wish to speak?
No, as I said, as in the previous piece of legislation, I'm happy to take questions from members.
Do any members wish to speak on Articles 1 to 17? No members wish to speak, then we close the debate. The members in favour of the articles, kindly show.
The appel.
Appel's been called for. I'll ask the greffier to open the voting on the articles. Applaud your enthusiasm, Deputy Poring. If all members have had an opportunity of voting, then I'll ask the greffier to close the vote. The articles have been adopted, 40 votes for and no votes contre. Move to third reading.
Yes, please, ma'am.
Do you wish to say anything in third
I
reading?
have nothing further to say. As I said, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Is the matter seconded in third reading?
Yes, ma'am.
Does any member wish to speak? Deputy Moran.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was tapping away on the button, so it was a drum. Thank you, and I just wanted to thank the Home Affairs Minister. As I mentioned, I have to leave the Assembly to help a family member, so I won't likely be able to vote or speak on the next sets of legislation, but I wanted to thank the Home Affairs Minister and the Scrutiny Panel for their work on this, as well as the Children's Minister, Assistant Minister, Deputy Scott, and all the officers who have worked on this legislation in different ways. And so I'm talking across a suite of 5 or 6 pieces of legislation. But I just wanted to say as well, I wanted to reiterate my concern that the one thing that appears to be missing at the moment is a full strategic approach to these offences. One of the things that keeps coming back to my mind is, and I know we've discussed funding, I won't go there, I agree with all those who have raised concerns about ongoing funding, but I also agree with the Chief Minister that let's get these laws in place and let's not wait for the perfect package, let's start. But we do need a holistic approach, a strategic approach. And I think one thing that needs to be part of that is mental health and resources for mental health to ensure, because a lot of these crimes, I think, in many ways are driven by people who find themselves in difficult places personally within their own minds. And I just think that there's one thing that doesn't seem to be mentioned so far is the need to invest in our mental health services so that we can try to prevent effectively these offences happening in the first place, or if they have happened, then try to make sure that they, recidivism is not a result of our kind of lack of a strategic approach to that. So I just really want to push forward that sense that for the next government, a full strategy around crimes against violence against women and girls, but also the whole online space and the artificial intelligence space, which I know is exactly what we're dealing with here. But these are places that no one minister or one scrutiny panel or anything can solve. It needs to be the whole community coming together. We've got to decide things like appropriate measures around the impact of devices on our mental health. And these also are part of the same conversation. They're different branches of exactly the same tree, basically. And so, yeah, it was just that sense that there's a lot more work to do. But I congratulate the Home Affairs Minister and all those who have helped her and other ministers in bringing all of these pieces of legislation forward.
Does any other member wish to speak in third reading? If no other member wishes to speak, then I close the debate and call on the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am, and I thank Deputy Morrell for his contribution. I fully agree with him in relation to mental health, and it will be no surprise, having chaired the Mental Health Scrutiny Panel for 4 years, and the amount of work that was done in relation to that. But I think sometimes we do something and then we've done something and then we forget about it. Whereas I think we need to, as the Deputy rightly said, we need to have a holistic approach, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. This was started in 2021 with the agreement in the budget and the violence against women and girls, but there is a lot more that we need to be doing, and I think, as the Deputy rightly said, the next government will need to sit down and work out how the deck chairs then all fit together. And I thank everyone for their contributions and call for the appel.
Appel has been called for. Members are invited to return to their seats. And I ask the greffier to open the voting. All members have had an opportunity to cast their votes. I ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce that the law has been adopted in third reading, 42 votes for and no votes contra. So the next item is the Draft Domestic Abuse Jersey Amendment Law 2000, P7 of 2026, lodged by the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs. The main respondent is again the chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel, and I ask the greffier to read the citation.
Draft Domestic Abuse Jersey Amendment Law 2000, a law to amend the Domestic Abuse Jersey Law 2022 to provide for emergency barring notices and emergency barring orders. The states, subject to the sanction of His Most Excellent Majesty and Council, have adopted the following law.
Minister.
Thank you, Ma'am. I would now like to move into the third piece of legislation, which amends the existing domestic abuse law. The purpose of this amendment is to create new powers for the police and courts so that they are able to protect victims of domestic abuse in cases where a perpetrator has not yet been charged or convicted. In 2025, 93 victims of domestic abuse in Jersey were assessed as being at high and immediate risk of being murdered or seriously injured. In 28 of these cases, children were living in the household where domestic abuse was taking place. In this context of immediate danger, the most practical and effective way to protect a victim of domestic abuse is by creating physical distance between the victim and the abuser. Emergency barring powers give the police and the courts the authority they need to create this distance. They allow them to place restrictions on the behaviour of suspects for the purposes of protecting the victim from further abuse. In a similar vein to the stalking protection orders that the Assembly has already voted through, emergency barring notices and orders can prevent a perpetrator from contacting a victim, coming with a specified distance of them, or entering the victim's home. These measures are crucial for the protection of victims because they offer a cooling down period to de-escalate an abuser's behaviour and ensures that victims are not in danger whilst the police collect the evidence they need to make an arrest. That is why so many jurisdictions have, in the last 10 years, introduced emergency barring orders. It is also why Article 52 of the Istanbul Convention on Eliminating Violence Against Women and Girls and Domestic Abuse requires jurisdictions to introduce these powers. Many jurisdictions across Europe, Australia and North America have introduced barring orders that allow for the immediate removal of an abuser from a home and can prohibit contact but do not require previous criminal conviction. They are an essential tool in the wider arsenal of any jurisdiction seeking to address the crimes associated with violence against women and girls. Members will already be aware that under the current domestic abuse law, we have domestic abuse protection orders. The purpose of these orders is to protect victims of domestic abuse from further abuse. The problem is the courts are only able to issue these orders if a perpetrator has already been convicted of a relevant offence. This means that in cases where a perpetrator does not have a prior conviction, the police and the courts cannot use domestic abuse protection orders to protect victims. Only once a perpetrator's behaviour has become more dangerous, the justice process has taken its course and a perpetrator has been successfully convicted, are the courts able to offer victims protection by issuing a domestic abuse protection order. Isn't this backwards? Surely we should be offering protection to victims when they need it most, when the perpetrator is still free and poses a considerable threat to their safety. Shouldn't we be preventing domestic abuse? Shouldn't we be offering protection before the abuse gets worse, instead of after the abuse has escalated? Under our current system, law enforcement must wait for the abuse to reach a certain level before they are able to provide victims with this protection. This is wrong. The threshold for protection is too high. Not only does this place vulnerable victims at an unnecessary risk of harm, it also makes the prosecution of perpetrators of domestic abuse more difficult. Members will be aware that our conviction rate for domestic abuse in Jersey is not where we would like it to be. I have worked with the police to understand why that is. In many cases, a failure to take an initial report of domestic abuse all the way through to a successful conviction is due to victims withdrawing from the prosecution process. Although the police can still pursue a prosecution without the victim's support, it is drastically more difficult to obtain a conviction without the victim's evidence. I want to make it clear, ma'am, I'm not blaming the victims and I'm not saying it is their fault. One of the key reasons why victims withdraw from the prosecution process is because they are pressured to do so by the perpetrator. When living under a constant threat of abuse, many do not feel they have any other choice. Under this new law, we would be able to offer a new level of protection for victims whilst they are going through the justice process. We would be able to prohibit the perpetrator from contacting them and trying to pressure them to withdraw from the process, and more importantly, we would be able to protect victims from the threat of further abuse. If a perpetrator does not comply with the conditions of such an order, we would have the power to arrest them and therefore provide protection through that mechanism. I want to amend the domestic abuse law to fix these problems by creating new powers for law enforcement that allow them to effectively respond to perpetrators of domestic abuse and provide meaningful protection to victims. This amendment does this by introducing new powers for the police called emergency barring notices and new powers for the courts called emergency barring orders. Emergency barring notices are new powers that allow the police to intervene with perpetrators of domestic abuse and shield victims from the risk of further abuse. Under this law, the police will be able to issue an emergency barring notice in cases where in cases where they suspect that a person has committed a domestic abuse and they consider that a notice is necessary to protect that victim. Under this notice, the police are able to prohibit a suspect from a number of activities, such as contacting the victim, coming within a specified distance of the victim, or entering the victim's residence for up to 72 hours. The police can issue these notices regardless of whether the suspect has a previous criminal conviction. Importantly, these powers will grant the police the authority to bar a perpetrator from entering their own residence if they share that residence with a victim. Some members might consider this ability to bar a suspect from their own home to be extreme, but in reality, all this does is ensure that this burden falls on a perpetrator rather than a victim. Under our current arrangement, it is usually the victim who is forced to flee from their home, often with their children, because it is no longer safe to stay there. These new powers reverse the situation so that vulnerable victims and children are able to stay in the comfort and safety of their own home, whilst the perpetrator is the one who is inconvenienced and must find somewhere else to stay. In cases where a perpetrator breaches the conditions of their emergency barring notice, the police have a power to arrest them and then apply to the court for an emergency barring order. Obviously, domestic abuse investigations are complex and will often take longer than 72 hours. In many cases, victims will still be at risk after the notice period has lapsed and require further protection. This is why we've also introduced new long-term powers for the courts called emergency barring orders. Under these orders, the courts will also have the power to impose a number of restrictions and conditions on a perpetrator of domestic abuse, like prohibiting contact with the victim or entry into the victim's residence. But these orders can last for up to 3 months, and breaching the order is an offence that carries a penalty of up to 5 years. Again, these orders do not require a prior conviction. Because these orders consist of a more serious and long-term restriction on a person's liberty, they are rightly subject to a more serious evidential test. Unlike notices where a police officer need only suspect a person has perpetrated domestic abuse, only the courts have the power to issue an emergency barring order. And even then, only once they are satisfied on the balance of probabilities that a person has engaged in domestic abuse. These powers are not controversial. They have been in place in the UK since 2024. The purpose of this amendment is to ensure that the police in Jersey are able to offer victims of domestic abuse the same protections that have been available on the mainland for more than 10 years. Addressing domestic abuse is not a simple task. It is important that we come at this work from a number of angles to ensure that we are prioritising the prevention of this abuse in the future, whilst also ensuring that we have the right support, protection and legislation in place to respond to domestic abuse when it does happen. We have already introduced an offence of domestic abuse to ensure the effective prosecution of perpetrators. We have helped to remove financial barriers to escaping abuse by introducing exceptional financial support for victims of domestic abuse who would not ordinarily be able to access income support. And we're in the process of rolling out an important education programme for children and young people so that they can enter into new relations with a strong understanding of what is safe, respectful and healthy. Introducing new measures to effectively manage perpetrators and protect victims is another very important piece of the puzzle. It is time that we bring our legislation into line with best practice and remove unnecessary obstacles to the safety of victims of domestic abuse and their children. This law provides our police service and our courts with the powers they need to provide them with immediate protection. I therefore ask the Assembly to give their support to this amendment to the existing domestic abuse law. Thank you, Ma'am.
On the principle, seconded. Deputy Scott.
Well, there isn't much to say about this, but I will make this observation in the context of the protection of victims of domestic abuse. It seems extraordinary that we've had tree protection orders, emergency tree protection orders in place, but not this. I'll support the proposition.
St Saviour.
Thank you, Mum. I will, of course, be supporting this, Mum. Many years ago, I worked at an establishment that there was a young lady there who was in her early 20s, married, had a black eye on quite numerous occasions. And in her own words, I'm so dipsy, I keep walking into the cupboard door in the kitchen. And this, sadly, does go on quite a lot to this day, that some women are so browbeaten that they're convinced that somehow it's their fault, which is a great shame. And obviously, a lot of people have young children. They don't want to disrupt the household. And I think the Minister has more or less answered my next question, really, that if the person concerned, or the victim, shall I say, withdraws the complaint, can the police now pursue it anyway, or do they need the victim to press charges? Because often it's not. The victim may be persuaded or coerced or whatever to drop charges by the husband, and so it goes on. I wonder if the Minister could answer that question in her summing up. Thank you, Mum.
Does any other member wish to speak on principles? Deputy Curtis.
Thank you, Mum. So the draft law is to introduce emergency barring notices and emergency barring orders. Emergency barring notices can last up to 72 hours or longer if an emergency barring order has been determined. emergency barring orders can be imposed for up to 3 months at a time. Both notices and orders can be issued prior to a conviction. The panel suggested that the Attorney-General should develop and issue a directive to accompany guidance detailing how children should be dealt with when they are subject to the draft law in order to ensure a child-centred approach, and I thank the Attorney-General for his earlier comments. The panel also recognises the devastating impact on children of domestic abuse and welcomes this amendment law in reducing this impact on women and children. Concerns remain, though, about the impact on police resource. Detailed training will be required in order to assist officers in making difficult decisions around emergency barring notices, for example, whether a claim is vexatious or in instances of complexities around property use, etc. However, these measures could well prevent more serious harm occurring and are welcomed by the panel.
Does any other member wish to speak? If no other member wishes to speak, then I close the debate on the principles and call on the Minister to reply.
Thank you, Ma'am. As I think I did mention, yes, the police can still continue with a prosecution, but there are all sorts of different factors as to whether that would continue. It would be based probably on the level of injury sustained to a victim along with other matters. But of course, not having support of a victim will always make the case more challenging. So it is better that there is that support. And this is why these barring notices are quite important, and the barring orders as well issued by the courts, because that means that there is a space between the two parties, which hopefully will start to address some of the concerns that may lead to victims actually withdrawing their complaints. These barring orders and these things have been in the UK and other countries for a number of years, and I just think we, as an island, need to move forward with this legislation in order that we make ourselves fit for purpose. In relation to the scrutiny panel's chair's comments, with any new piece of legislation, regardless of what that is, that has an impact on the training implications for the police and other agencies. Whatever legislation is brought in through this assembly, whether it's police, environment, anywhere, then training implications will also always follow. It will be part and parcel of continual development of all police officers, as happens with everything. In relation to, there will be costs in relation to the courts, because obviously this is an introduction, but as again I said before, I do feel that by introducing these, what I would say, necessary preventative measures early on in any situation will hopefully change the dynamic of what the actual sort of end remit is. So by having orders with the police and the courts early, then hopefully victims will continue with the prosecutions because they will feel supported a lot more than maybe they do now, but also as well that will prevent further harm to those victims. And I appreciate that there is a cost to this, but it is, for me, a cost we have to, or it is a cost we have to have. Thank you, Ma'am, and I ask for the appel.
The appel has been called for. I invite members to return to their seats if they're in the vicinity. Members are in their seats, and I'll ask the greffier to open the voting. If everyone has had an opportunity now to cast their votes, I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce the principles have been adopted, 42 votes for, no votes contra. Does the chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel wish to scrutinise the matter? How do you wish to propose the articles, Minister?
I'd like to propose them en bloc, please, ma'am.
Do you wish to speak to them at all?
No, thank you, ma'am. I will do the same as I've done with the previous two. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
There are 6 articles. Does any member wish to speak on those articles? No members wish to speak. Then I close the debate. Members who are in favour of adopting, the appell's been called for. I think members are already in their seats, so I'll ask the greffier to please open the voting on Articles 1 to 6. Everyone has cast their vote. Ask the greffier to close the voting. I can announce the articles have been adopted, 42 votes for and no votes contra. Should we move to third reading, Minister?
Yes, please, ma'am.
Is the matter seconded in third reading? Does any member wish to speak? No member wishes to speak. Those members who are in favour of adopting the law in third reading, kindly show. The appell's been called for. I'll ask the greffier to open the voting on third reading. If everyone's had an opportunity to cast their vote, I'll ask the greffier to close the voting. And I can announce that the draft Domestic Abuse Jersey Amendment Law has been adopted in third reading, 42 votes for and no votes contra. So we move to the next item, which is the Draft Crime Strangulation Jersey Law 2000, P8, lodged by the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs. The main respondent is again the Chair of the Children, Education and Home Affairs Scrutiny Panel, and I ask the greffier to read the citation.
Draft Crime Strangulation Jersey Law 2000, a law to introduce a statutory offence of strangulation. The states, subject to the sanction of His Most Excellent Majesty and Council, have adopted the following law.
Minister.
Thank you, ma'am. The purpose of this law is to improve the way our criminal justice system responds to perpetrators of strangulation by introducing a new standalone strangulation offence. In recent years, there has been a growing awareness that strangulation is a common feature of the abuse suffered by domestic abuse victims. In the context of domestic abuse, an incident of strangulation is a critical indicator that the abuse is escalating to very dangerous violence. The statistics are distressing. When a perpetrator strangles a partner, they are over 7 times more likely to go on to kill that partner. Strangulation is an indicator of the deadly abuse that is to come. It is well evidenced that perpetrators who strangle their intimate partners are among the most dangerous offenders because they are far more likely to engage in extreme violence. Strangulation represents an ultimate form of control, wherein the perpetrator literally takes the life of the victims in their hands. Engaging in this form of violence says a lot about the mindset of an abuser and how far they are willing to go. When a perpetrator strangles, they are demonstrating a willingness to kill while the victim is subjected to a terrifying and painful experience. In addition to being a strong risk factor for lethal violence, strangulation can also cause severe and lasting physical harm to a victim. That is because strangulation causes blood clots and the prolonged reduction of blood flow to the brain. The resulting brain injury can have significant long-term consequences, impacting a survivor's memory, attention and concentration, speech and language skills, and vulnerability to mental health difficulties. Strangulation also significantly increases the risk of stroke because of the damage done to the blood vessels in the victim's neck. This is now thought to be one of the leading causes of strokes in women under 40. Despite the clear dangers associated with strangulation, it is an act that has become increasingly normalised. We know that the depictions of strangulation in pornographic on pornography have become so commonplace that many young people think that is normal sexual behaviour. Indeed, teachers are reporting repeated cases of teenage boys asking how they can safely strangle their sexual partners. This is what we are up against. Strangulation can never be safe. We need to realise just how serious this is. Under our existing legislation, strangulation can be prosecuted under the customary offences of common law, assault, or grave and criminal assault. Up until now, there has never been a specific offence of strangulation in Jersey. There are a number of reasons why this arrangement needs to change. Under these assault offences, strangulation is treated as one example of a much wider range of physical assaults. The seriousness of strangulation is not appropriately recognised. Instead, strangulation is treated like other forms of assault, and the severity and danger of this act is not appreciated. Moreover, because these offences are designed to capture a wide range of violent acts, a wide range of penalties are available for those who are found guilty. Such a large range of sentences should not be available for perpetrators of strangulation. There is a real risk that perpetrators will receive sentences that are far too low. The strangulation is an acute form of violence that should be met with a long sentence that appropriately reflects the severity of the act. Under the existing law, there are very minor limits on using the consent of the victim as a defence. A person can claim the defence against the charge of common assault with no restriction. In many cases, they can even claim this defence against the charge of grave and criminal assault. It only becomes unavailable if the victim has lost consciousness. Strangulation is such a severe form of violence that because it is prosecuted under these offences, there is very real risk that perpetrators will be able to use the consent defence without suitable restriction. Introducing a new standalone offence of strangulation fixes these problems. That is why so many other jurisdictions, including England and Wales, Northern Ireland, Australia, have introduced specific strangulation offences. Introducing a standalone strangulation offence allows the seriousness and severity of this act to be properly recognised in law. In the absence of a standalone offence, non-fatal strangulation may be misidentified, misrecorded, or prosecuted only as a lower level assault, particularly due to the absence of visible injuries and the absence of a weapon. This standalone offence provides a statutory basis for strangulation as distinct from the customary offences of common and grave and criminal assault. This allows us to provide a very clear definition of what strangulation actually is. We have defined the act of strangling to include suffocating, choking, and restriction a person's breathing or blood flow to their brain by any means. It also allows us to introduce specified sentences for this offence that more appropriately recognise the seriousness of the form of violence under this new law. The offence of strangulation will carry a penalty of up to 10 years imprisonment and a fine, a sentence that is proportionate to the harm caused by these offenders. Finally, the introduction of a specified strangulation offence has also allowed us to place more stringent restrictions around the use of the defence of consent. Now, there has been some criticism of the decision to include a consent defence at all, and a feeling that this is at odds with our wider aim of supporting victims of violence against women and girls. I had the same reservations, same concerns during the process of the law development, wherein I received earlier drafts of a law that included a consent defence, and so I want to address this head on. First of all, it is important to explain why we've included a defence of consent. Under the European Convention on Human Rights, Jersey has a series of obligations relating to upholding our island's human rights. Article 8 of the Convention, rights to a private life, protects the right of personal development and autonomy. Sexual activity is, of course, associated with an individual's exercise of free choice, and the question of consent to strangulation is typically discussed in the context of sexual relations. The inclusion of a strangulation offence as a consent defence allows us to strike a balance between deterring islanders from this harmful behaviour and respecting their personal autonomy. That is why the consent defence has been included in this law. Now, quite rightly, the inclusion of this defence has created concern that that it will be used as a fallback defence for perpetrators who will rely on alleged consent when in fact no consent was given and place victims in the unfair position of having to prove they did not consent. This concern is misplaced. I can assure members that strong safeguards have been put in place to restrict the misuse of this defence. Let me explain how. Under this law, a person has a defence if they can prove that on the balance of probabilities the victim consented to the act of strangulation, and either the victim did not suffer serious harm, or if the victim did suffer serious harm, the defendant did not intend to and was not reckless in causing it. This does not place victims in the position of having to prove consent that was not given. Quite the opposite. A defendant wants to use this defence. This law places the burden on them to prove each element of the defence. The law also places very clear limitations on the use of this defence in cases where a victim of strangulation suffers harm. In such cases, the defence will only be available to the defendant if they can prove, on the balance of probabilities, that he or she did not intend to cause that harm and was not reckless as to whether the victim would suffer that harm. Under this law, a person cannot consent to serious harm. Therefore, where serious harm is intentionally or recklessly caused, the consent defence is not available. And we know that in almost every case of strangulation, serious harm is caused. This law aligns with the defence provision in the UK. The experience on the mainland has already demonstrated that these limitations on the consent defence make it extremely difficult for the defence to successfully argue consent, as it requires that no serious harm has been done, a standard that is rarely met in cases of actual strangulation. I want to be clear. The introduction of strangulation offence allows us to recognise the severity of strangulation in law, hand down higher sentences to dangerous offenders, and place proper limitations on the use of consent defence. Under this new law, we estimate that roughly 45 strangulation offences will be recorded in the second year of implementation. As strangulation is already recorded under our existing assault offences, this does not translate into 45 additional crimes going through our justice system, as many of the reports that would have been classified under an assault offence will now be classified under our new strangulation offence instead. The impact of introducing strangulation offences is far-reaching. Following the lodging of this law, academics from the University of Exeter shared the findings from their recent study, Disrupting Violence, Protecting Lives, Strangulation Laws and Intimate Partner Homicides. Their research shows that introducing standalone offences of non-fatal strangulation can substantially reduce incidences of intimate partner homicide. They found that in US states where specific strangulation offences had been introduced, intimate partner homicides fell between 14 and 27%. This is because strangulation offences empower earlier, stronger intervention with perpetrators in interrupting the pathway from strangulation to homicide. Why do these laws prevent intimate partner homicides? Because they enable law enforcement to appropriately recognise incidents of strangulation as high-risk abuse, intervene with perpetrators and disrupt the cycle of violence before it turns lethal. Ma'am, strangulation is a severe form of violence. We know that when standalone strangulation offences are introduced, they work. It is time that we introduce our own strangulation offence in Jersey so that we can intervene with dangerous perpetrators before their behaviour can escalate further, and so that we can provide victims with the protections they need. I therefore ask members to support the introduction of this vital new offence. Thank you, ma'am.
On the principle seconded. Does any member wish to speak on the principles? Deputy Coles.
Sorry, ma'am, it's more of a question for the AG, if that is possible. And whether the... See if he's... Make sure he was ready before. Would the AG please clarify that the loss of consciousness would also be at the point where consent is withdrawn?
I'm not sure that would arise from the criminal law as an issue, because if consciousness is lost, that is serious harm, and it cannot then be a defence. to say, well, the person consented. So the fact of serious harm, and that is that includes loss of consciousness, means there is no consent defence.
Deputy Scott, do you have a question for the Attorney General as well?
Yes, I just wanted to explore this this statement that under the current legal, and this is actually the way that scrutiny have put it, under the current legal framework in Jersey, incidents of strangulation are prosecuted as common assault or grave and criminal assault. And the panel were advised that this position did not fully capture the severity of the offence. I'm just trying to understand where customary law is inadequate, and in particular because there's being a distinction made between certain types of assault, and I'm thinking of, unfortunately, all manner of horrific ways in which people can assault people, whether it's, I don't even want to suggest them actually, but you know, what is it that the customary law is, you know, deficient? I just would like that advice, please.
Well, I don't think the customary law is deficient, and I think that those of us who work in the criminal justice system, that has been our position. But we recognise that the review suggested that a separate offence of non-fatal strangulation was desirable. That certainly has been the political view, and the offence that appears in this proposition fits the bill.
Deputy Balash.
So I had certainly, Madam, I beg your pardon, I had certainly taken the view that the decision to introduce a separate offence of strangulation was a politically motivated decision, because I confess that I have some reservations about the wisdom of creating a new statutory offence of strangulation when this is essentially already an offence at customary law as an offence of grave and criminal assault. Even if the characteristics of grave and criminal assault may be slightly different from the characteristics of the proposed statutory offence. I don't want to go into those technical details, but I would ask the Attorney General to reflect upon the exchange of correspondence that we have had this morning. I make the point also that the maximum penalty under the customary law offence is one of life imprisonment, whereas the statutory offence contains a rather shorter maximum penalty. And in addition, that the statutory offence limits the right of the defendant to a jury trial. A statutory offence will be tried before the jurats, whereas a customary law offence is tried before a jury. And so a person prosecuted under this statutory offence will not have a right to trial by jury. More importantly, I think I would like to say that I absolutely agree with the Minister that strangulation is a highly dangerous practice and that we ought to structure our law in such a way as to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. There was an interesting article in The Economist just over a year ago which stated, amongst other things, that a meta-study in 2020 suggested that strangulation may be the second most common cause of stroke in British women under 40. And it also recorded a survey in Australia which found that most first encountered such strangulation in online porn. I think that the practice has undoubtedly been normalized by people watching online porn. And I would have liked to have seen a slightly different approach to the solution to this really toxic problem. Amongst other things, I'd like to see the Education Department ensuring that in appropriate classes in schools, children are informed of the dangers of this practice. But I would also like consideration to be given, and this again is something that may perhaps be considered in the Law Officers Department, as to whether it is possible to create an offence of creating an electronic image of an act of strangulation in the context of consensual sexual intercourse. If a man downloaded such an image, he would be guilty of an offence. After a few prosecutions, men might get the idea that this was a highly dangerous practice which ought not to be engaged in. I, as I say, have reservations about the law, but I'm not going to oppose it because I think that this is a dangerous practice and it certainly ought to be dealt with appropriately.
Deputy Miller.
Thank you, Ma'am. Is that working? Sorry, now it's broken altogether. Sorry. Microphone malfunction. Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Ma'am. Sorry about that. I said earlier that I would only speak once really in this suite of legislation, and while I absolutely support the Minister in bringing these laws together, I can't help but feel that the whole subject matter is deeply depressing, that we are having to introduce these types of offences into our laws to address these types of behaviours. And this, I think, is the one that I find most distressing, because to some degree I have Deputy Balash's confusion, shall we say, about this, because I simply do not understand when this became a thing, when strangulation in any form of relationship, particularly in the context of a sexual relationship, has become something that people do. And I had a bit of a light bulb moment on this, I think last year or the year before. Sarah Champion MP was in the island and someone hosted a talk with her. Sarah Champion has done a lot of work in with child sexual exploitation and also in highlighting the problem of grooming gangs. And I asked her about the accessibility of porn and how much of an issue that was. And she said, yes, it absolutely was. And the light bulb moment for me was that I've also always kind of, in a massive gender stereotyping of my own, assumed that it's boys looking at porn. But it's not. She said all young people are looking at porn. It's not just a thing that men do or boys do. Young girls are looking at it as well. And as others have said, it's becoming normalised. And she spoke about being with a class of 11-year-olds, and an 11-year-old girl saying, well, yes, I would quite like to have a boyfriend, but I don't want to be strangled. And that is what they are learning. They are learning at a very early age that that is something. And the irony of it, and I do hesitate to go down this path, because I'm sure someone would correct me, but my understanding from training courses I've been on in a previous role is that semi-asphyxiation does do something for men in the sexual context. It does, but it does not do the same for women. Women do not have a physiological pleasure response from being in a state of semi-asphyxiation. So there is no point in doing this. It is dangerous, and we really need to do more. And I think the whole question of online accessibility to porn and other information online for young children is something we as an Assembly, like everybody else, really have to get to grips with. And I'll just make one final observation in terms of this whole series of debates. Ma'am, a few of the propositions that have been before us, or maybe before us this week, have caused me to reflect on how very fortunate I have been in very many aspects of my life. And one of them is that I have never, ever encountered violence. I have met women who have, including life-threatening violence and coercive control. I've also met a man who's been subject to violence. I have seen, or certainly suspected it, in same-sex partnerships. It is all round, and we have to do something more to stop it. I think it starts really from what we tell children at a very young age. I remember my dad telling my brothers consistently throughout childhood, they must never ever hit a woman. That was just not something that was ever to be done. And by hearing that, I grew up with the view that no one should ever, ever hit me. And I'm fortunate never to have had to deal with it, but people do, and we really need to do everything we can to stop violence in all its forms, particularly in the home, regardless of who is the victim. Thank you, ma'am.
Deputy Farnham.
Thank you, ma'am. Something that has stayed with me for some time was when a victim of domestic abuse told me that they would wake up in the morning with their partner's hands around their throat, not as an act of sexual gratification or attempt at that, but as a form of coercive control. Non-fatal strangulation, as the Minister has said, is one of the clearest warning signs of escalating domestic abuse and a strong predictor of future homicide. It is a life-threatening act, yet often leaves little or no visible injury, which means it can be difficult to prosecute under existing assault laws. Creating a specific offence ensures the law properly recognises the seriousness of this behaviour and allows the police and the courts to intervene to protect victims. Thank you, ma'am.
Deputy Scott.
Thank you, ma'am. I thank Deputy Miller and Deputy Balash on addressing this issue of how porn has normalised certain behaviours. I think, though, that there is a general education that also has to go on, and I'm sure the Minister will speak to that, just about what porn is, that it objectifies people, and that in a sense that can be built on until you don't actually see those people as human beings at all. And indeed, and then it kind of encourages a sort of pattern where you get rather more extreme forms of porn called snuff. And I guess this is all part of the conversation. I just would request the Minister speak a bit more about this when we're talking about resourcing. Thank you, sir.
Deputy Catherine Curtis.
Thank you, ma'am. Firstly, Deputy Balash raised concerns around strangulation on porn sites. I'll just remind members that unlike the UK, Jersey children are not required to prove age verification for accessing porn. And although the panel's online harms review recommended measures to stop children accessing porn, there's no evidence to show that age verification will be brought into Jersey. Children in Jersey of any age can just click onto a porn site and will see many images and recordings of strangulation. The panel very much welcomes this law against strangulation, considering that non-fatal strangulation can cause lasting harm and is much more serious than the current prosecution under common assault or grave and common criminal assault allows. Figures in the UK show that victims of non-fatal strangulation are 7 times more likely to be killed by their abuser later. Strangulation is the second most frequent method of killing women in the UK after stabbing. And we welcome the amendment to include suffocation and choking. The importance of this new law cannot be overstated. A previous speaker questioned whether this new law is necessary, and I think it's clear when the evidence is studied that it certainly is necessary and is a growing problem. The panel's main concern with this law is around the impact on the prison. Longer prison sentences will require more prison capacity. It will not be possible to commit a sexual or violent offender to a prison sentence if there's no space in the prison. We're also concerned about operational preparedness around a clearly defined medical pathway for assessing evidential arrangements. And while the panel is very supportive, we ask the Minister to respond to these concerns on prison capacity and on the medical pathway for assessing evidential arrangements.
Mr. Attorney General.
Can I correct an observation I made earlier, because I'm quite rightly reminded by those who perhaps have more daily involvement than I have been able to have in recent months. I'm reminded that where strangulation, non-fatal strangulation, is prosecuted as a grave and criminal assault, it has been noticed that there is a tendency for juries to acquit of that more serious assault, often because the strangulation will not have resulted in any visible or serious injury, and they will instead convict of the much lesser offence of common assault, which will usually attract a much lower sentence. I'm reminded that one of the benefits of a specifically tailored new offence of non-fatal strangulation is that the tribunal would be focused on the act of strangulation, and given that it would attract or carries a maximum of 10 years imprisonment, there will be, in the event of conviction, greater scope for courts to pass more meaningful sentences. So I apologise to the Assembly that I slightly shot from the hip earlier, but I'm rightly reminded that I should have made those points, and I've done so.
Deputy Doublé.
Thank you, Ma'am. I wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned in the scrutiny panel comments about operational preparedness, some of which the Chair has touched upon. And I wanted to understand specifically about the medical pathways for assessing evidential arrangements if there is evidence of non-fatal strangulation. I wondered if the Health Minister or one of his assistant ministers would be able to inform the Assembly, because at the public hearing with the Home Affairs Minister, the panel were informed that they couldn't receive an update on that at the time because it was with the Health Minister. So if the Minister or one of his assistant ministers is able to update the Assembly about what training will be provided to practitioners, are they confident that medical practitioners will be able to spot whether this has happened, and if they do spot it, will they be able to support the victim and be able to collect evidence around this, that any potential case has that evidence behind it?
In accordance with Standing Order 44, an eye on the time, it falls to me to the question to the Assembly. The adjournment is proposed. Do those in favour wish to show? Those against? The adjournment is approved, and the Assembly stands adjourned until 2:15.